Well, I'm Landis Graden. I want to first welcome everybody for coming out on, everyone has busy schedules in this day and age, and I just want to welcome you all for coming. This day is really dedicated to supporting ministries and learning some basics about real estate development. And so our company, DCG, we've been doing this work for about 20 years, and it actually started here on this campus. And so as I was just sitting in the back of the pews, I was full-time commercial real estate investing and things like that. And Bishop Macklin would always say, hey, I need you to do this. I need you to do that. I need you to do this. And then my phone starts ringing because he would also tell other pastors, just call Brother Landis. And that's really how it started. And they would call me and we'd sit down. And, you know, it wasn't about money. It was just about providing support to churches. And all of a sudden, I'm working with all the churches that Bishop Macklin had me call. And then that's how I got started supporting ministries in real estate. And we're here today to make sure that ministries are empowered and supported as those that want to move forward in housing have the understanding of what goes into that. And so first, but let me acknowledge, so Megan in the back here put this all together, so we want to say thanks to Megan. And the Glad Tidings family, we want to just acknowledge all their selfless support, including Pastor Aaron over here. And so let me just start with two quick stories, which kind of epitomize why the reason we're here. So doing this work, we see it all, right? We see from concept all the way through completion, and we're deeply involved in a lot of the aspects of development. But two stories come to mind. One, I received a church call, and these calls happen all the time, and they were explaining, and this was last year, they were explaining that they had just finished a new development in the East Bay, and they had a affordable housing developer partner, and they wanted to learn a little bit about what they can do for fiscal sustainability. And so as I probed for questions, they said, well, you just completed the project, but our budget is challenged because we are now responsible for maintaining the new commercial space within the development. And we are already fiscally unsustainable prior to doing the development. And as we walked through the conversation, I realized that ministry would be bankrupt this time next year because they didn't have the financial support to maintain the building that they were legally obligated to. And it was a very depressing call. And so before they went through the development, they owned the site. They had a heart for meeting a certain housing need for a vulnerable population. They partnered with a developer, was an affordable housing developer, and I'm not disparaging affordable housing developers because they do great work. But the ministry didn't understand the financial obligations. They didn't understand the particulars of the development agreement. Therefore, they were unaware of what their responsibility was post-development. And those things were never explained to them. So now they're leasing back space as a church on land they used to own, and they're financially responsible for maintaining the structure. The money they thought they were going to get actually was used to build out their space, and now they have no more money to sustain the church. So I don't know if they're closed now or not. So that's one example of why it is very important to just understand all the different impacts of what it means to be in real estate development. Another one is a church that called because they were on the back end. This was both of these were tax credit deals, and there are other structures, but they were on the back end of 15 years after having done a tax credit deal with an out-of-area affordable housing developer. This is another East Bay church. And they were desperately trying to put together funding to hold on to their asset. Because in the development agreement, they had to buy it back from the developer. They didn't understand what that obligation was, and it was in the millions. And to make a long story short, they ended up losing the property because they couldn't raise the funding to buy it back. Another example of not understanding what they were committing themselves to. It was a great idea. It was 100% ministry for them, but there were fundamentals that they should have understood. So this day is about exposing churches to those fundamentals. It is also about making sure ministries walk away empowered. Ministries have a lot of power and leverage when it comes to church, or I should say ministry or housing. But oftentimes, because that information isn't known, they just are the tail is wagging the dog, so to speak. And so we will walk through this day to learn from architects and attorneys and financial consultants and developers so that you have an understanding of what your role could be, should be, what your rights are, and that you can walk through these opportunities with your eyes wide open, understanding what your risk is, and making sure that at the end of the day, your vision is met. So, not everyone has a Bishop Macklin who's just this big mind who always knows how to keep strong advisors around him. And then he pulls together the collective wisdom of the group, and then he goes out and makes decisions. This is why you're seeing all of this today. And we are putting together this day to help you understand just how important it is for you to understand, to learn what you don't know before you sign on the dotted line. So we're glad you're here. Take lots of notes, ask tons of questions. Anyone that comes up, feel free to get their contact information, because we want you to learn how to put your own teams together and to be empowered in those conversations. And so I want to bring up Bishop Macklin, who is a man that needs no introduction, but truly someone who is a giant, not only in ministry, but in housing and real estate development, and just the fundamentals of how to make decisions and how to take a vision and get it into reality. And he is the senior pastor here, the founder of this church. And he won't say it, but what you see in this campus, I grew up in Union City. You couldn't come to this neighborhood when I was growing up. The police didn't come to this neighborhood. So the city owes him millions of dollars for increasing property values. But with that said, I'll bring up Bishop Macklin.
Sorry, I had to bring the members of my welcoming committee. Whatever the city owes me, I sure wish they'd pay up. Good morning, everybody. It is a joy to welcome you here to Glad Tidings, on North Campus side, and I certainly hope that you're blessed by coming. We had a conference here on Saturday and then repeated it on Sunday morning, and the theme of the conference, one word, was kindness. And so you are sitting in a kindness campus setting. So while you're here today, everybody, please. Thank you very much. All right. Having said that, thank you so much to Brother Landis Graden, who got his start here in terms of his relationship with the Lord and moving forward. And I saw the Lord do something great. So never underestimate the beginning of things. You never know where people are going. One plants, another waters, and God always gives the increase. And so I'm thankful to see how God has used him. I watched him grow from the very beginning and stepping out into this field and seeing what God has done. And he won't tell it, but I'll tell it to be perfectly clear about this. Much of what we did, particularly in the early days or early on, he stepped in to help us in terms of our property. We had bought it already, but in terms of looking at the different avenues that were available to us to maximize what has happened. And so whatever God gives to you, he never gives it to you. All right, I'm not preaching today, I know. All right, but whatever God gives to you, he's not giving it to you. And you're only you're just there to steward that and to move it from one place to the next and from one generation to the next. And for that, we're thankful. As long as you never claim it as your own, you have a good chance of going forward. But if you ever think it's only yours, that's where it stops. And so seeing you here today means that there are a lot of stewards in the house who are concerned about seeing it go forward. And for that, we're grateful and thankful to see every one of you that are here. So I hope you'll have a good time today. Perhaps we'll come back during this or a little bit later and talk a little bit more about our specifics and where we are. This is my son, the Pastor Aaron Macklin, who's the assistant pastor of this church. And so he's been responsible for helping set up in terms of all of the technology that's due today. Thank you, Vivian, and your staff and team of volunteers for being responsible for helping us here today. And I say to all of you, do not tie all of your ends together without considering the fact that there may be other places for you to go and other greater things for you to do with whatever God has given you to do with it. All right? And so I say it all the time. I'll say it again. It's a quote that'll become famous after I'm gone. But and I understand that. But I say this all the time, that if our circumstances are going to change, you've got to take a brush of faith and paint in vibrant living color on the canvas of your tomorrow. And so I'm hopeful that those who have come today are looking to paint a great picture of what your tomorrow can look like. And who knows whether God will use you for such a time as this. And your name may not be Esther, but you may be here in Esther's stead. And so God may be using you for that purpose and that time. And yes, this was that neighborhood that nobody wanted. And it's the Nehemiah story in living color. And to see what God can do. And you can have an impact on where you live. But look at all the options. Don't consider because that's all you have. But what you have may have been entrusted to you so that it can usher in yet greater things. And so your success will never be with what you know, but it'll be with those that God connects you to, who may know more if you can partner with them to go forward. And so who knows? God may use this day just for that purpose. So thank you so very much. Thank you for being here at the Glad Tidings campus. We've been here 46 years. The church has been here 46 years. We moved to this neighborhood 43 years ago. And but we started in our living room with my wife and I, and had two little children, and they all had to go to my church. But they're still connected to this church very much so. And for that, we are thankful. And the Lord, when I say this in city meetings, everybody, you're not supposed to mention God. I said, all right, whatever. Yeah, they asked me one time, brother, to come and do a conference. We were doing the welfare to work, and they couldn't get people to go back to work. And so they said, let's get the bishop to come lecture. I said, all right. So I came into a big room like this here. It's filled with people. They were trying to get off welfare and wasn't working too well. And they said, now listen, Reverend, you understand, you can't be talking about God up in here. He said, this is a county meeting, and we can't do all that. I said, fine. Are you sure? I said, fine. I won't mention him. And I didn't. I just talked to them, and I said, everybody in here know that you were created to do something more than what you're doing, don't you? Everybody said, yeah. I said, and you know who created you, don't you? Enjoy your day. God bless. Well, Landis, I brought my other hat with me just to remind everybody in here that you probably have more than one hat. God bless you.
So at some point, I think maybe you'll be oriented, but everything you see is all glad tidings, everything. So the original church was around the corner, and this entire block, and over across the street, and next door, that's all glad tidings. And it was vision, and patience, and resilience, and faith. And, I learned faith here. My life changed when my mom and our young family came to this church. And, I was sharing with somebody earlier. I was sitting in the back of the church, and then I just found myself kind of inching toward the front. And then Bishop just said, I have work for you to do. And I would just do it. And then over time, now I'm working side by side with him behind the scenes. And, working with church folks, or you get tired and you lose. And so Bishop, because of his duties around the world, he's traveling a lot. I've never told him this, but there were many times where I went home and told my wife, I'm quitting. I can't do this anymore. Because, someone in the church meeting is going sideways and I just can't take it. And there was one day I really was. When Bishop gets back to town, I'm telling him I'm quitting. And that happened 2 or 3 times. But I give this hand to God. Every time I felt like he'll be home in 2 days, and when he gets back, I'm going to get an appointment and tell him I'm quitting. He would call me from the road, Brother Landis, we got a problem. I need you to go do something. And but he didn't even know, right? And then he would send me to go do this and send me to go do that. And it was God's way of just keeping me patient. And I never understood that. But this is a patient process. But it's also a process that you for sure will reap the rewards if you just stay the course. And we're bringing up Megan, and she's going to facilitate a conversation with 2 pastors, Reverend Gerald Agee and Reverend Phil Burchard, who've been through this journey. And we thought it was just so important for those of you to see, yes, it's possible, and to hear directly from folks who've been through this. So I'm going to bring up Megan, and then she's going to facilitate a conversation that we hope just allows you to understand the journey.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm thrilled to be here. This is our second conference as part of the Ministry of Housing series. My name is Megan McIver, and I am Vice President of Real Estate at DCG Strategies. I'm also a candidate for ordination in the Lutheran Church. So I really have a background. Thank you. I got an applause last time too. That's really encouraging. That's also a long process of development, as you know. And so today I'm really thrilled to welcome Father Phil and Reverend Dr. Agee. If you'd like to come up now, we'll foreground the day with a discussion that really is going to take a little bit of a step back and think about housing as a ministry and building our why. And so I think as folks take their places, what I'll say is, in our work at DCG with churches, what we find out is that the importance of having a really clear sense of why we're doing something. What is the essence of your call? That is so critical to every phase of any real estate development, large or small. And so with that, I'll let our panelists introduce themselves. Thrilled to be here with them.
Good afternoon, actually good morning. We're just starting. My name is Phil Burchard. I serve as the rector or the priest with responsibility for All Souls Episcopal Church, which is in Berkeley on the north side of the Cal campus. I've been there for 15 years now. And Jordan Court, which was a project that we worked on for 7+ years, has been up, and people have been living in it now for about just coming up on 2 years, which feels like a miracle.
Good morning. My name is Gerald Agee. I'm the pastor of Friendship Christian Center Church in West Oakland. We've been in ministry we celebrated 30 years the 2nd of this January, and in the West Oakland area. So we've seen a lot of changes. We've seen a lot of the people coming and people leaving. And so we started our project about 7 years ago, actually putting together a team of people. But I'll talk about that later on in the meeting. But we're really glad to be here. It's a long process, and we know that God is really into serving people where they are, where they need. And so that's the main point. That's the main point that I would want to bring out in this session, is that God is a need-meeting God. And whatever the needs are, if we align ourselves with Him, He will meet the need.
So my first question is really about housing as a ministry. So certainly if a congregation feels called to contribute to ending the housing crisis or to providing housing to people in need, there are many ways to do that. Homeless shelters come to mind, food pantries, sort of ministries that we're all familiar with. But this ministry, building and providing housing on church land, feels and indeed is, I think, substantially different from those other roles. It's a new role. The church is asked to be a housing developer. So how do you each think about churches, developing and providing housing on properties as a ministry?
When my wife and I graduated from Bible college over 30 years ago, we could have went anywhere in the world for God. And we was prepared to do that. Wherever God was going to send us, that's where we wanted to be. He sent us back to Oakland, where we grew up. And he sent us particularly to the western part of Oakland. And so when we were coming back, I knew that God was not calling me to a building in Oakland. He was calling me to a city. And whatever the needs are in that city, then God somehow was going to bring my attention to needs in the community where he was planning us. And whatever those needs were, then those are some of the things that we would end up addressing. When we came back to Oakland, we were being plagued by crack cocaine. It was devastating, not just our community, but it was running rampant across the nation, and particularly in our community. I would see mothers with children in the rain asking for money only to get another fix. And it just bothered me. So we started a drug alcohol program, and we served a lot of people and got a lot of people back into a relationship with God. And so that was one of the needs. And then we helped other churches establish those kind of programs. And then God was able to shift us into another need, which was at the time public safety, where babies were being shot, grandmamas was being shot going to the store. And so we really made a lot of noise, got together with a lot of churches, and began to put focus on something needs to be done where people can feel safe in the city of Oakland. And then we started seeing the next crisis right after, well, it was actually before the pandemic. The pandemic came, we saw that people in our communities were not being served with the vaccines and with the testing. They was not going to the Coliseum. And so we raised a lot of noise concerning that and went to the city, didn't get any help, went to the county, didn't get any help. And we ended up going to the state. Governor Newsom asked us, the program that I'm a part of, if we could do something across the state. And we said, yeah, and they asked me to be the one to pinpoint it and to be the point of it. And so we established church test site in particularly urban areas and where people didn't have to go out of their neighborhood in order to get tested and vaccinated. And so we helped a lot of people during the pandemic. But we also saw that there was a need for housing that's affordable, because people that I went to school with, people I grew up with, were being actually pushed out of Oakland. And what bothered me is that a lot of the people I grew up with, they are seniors. And so we said that we got to do something about it. The cost of that kind of project is major, and it was no way that we can do it because the people that God sent me to was in West Oakland. Many of them were afflicted by drugs, alcohol, and all kind of things, and they just didn't have the money. I used to ask God, Lord, why don't you send me to some people from Danville, that can fund some of this stuff here. And But here's what he told me. He said, Gerald, raise them up. And we did. Some of the people that came through that were covered with drugs and alcohol and all kind of things, they were doctors, they were lawyers, they were teachers. And once they got their life together, those things begin to emerge. And that's the most beautiful thing that you can see. So we're about meeting the needs of the people. And right now it's housing.
I think the question that we started with was this question of that is actually a Jesus teaching, which is, Jesus says, love God, love your neighbor. And then somebody says, that's great, but who is my neighbor? And that's been challenging us ever since. And so that was a question we kept asking ourselves. We had a really rundown apartment building that we had purchased from an order of Episcopal monks. And it was really clear that it was not going to last that much longer, and we needed to do something with that building. We went to the city of Berkeley and said, what do you see, what has to happen here? And they said, well, we have 2 units of housing on our books for that building. And so whatever you're going to do, it needs to involve at least 2 units of housing. And so we looked at market rate housing. We brought in a local developer who said, okay, we could give you your 2 units of housing and some office space for your church. We'd give you a modest income, and then we would build out housing. And we're a few blocks, as I said, from the Cal campus. And so they said, we're going to put in 2-bedroom apartments. We put in bunk beds. We put in students. And that would help the situation because there's not a lot of housing, as you may know, in Berkeley for students. So we had that as an option. We had an option just to do a modest building that would just serve our own needs, that would have some spaces for our staff to live in because we were having a challenge trying to find space for our staff to live and some office space. And then we also wanted to look into affordable housing. And so we went to the city of Berkeley. We had a small team of people. And I know Dr. Agee and I talked about this earlier. A team of people is critical. And we had this team of folks that did some discernment. It was about a 5-person team. And they went to the city of Berkeley at some point and to the planning department and said, we're thinking about doing affordable housing. Who are the folks you work with who do good work, who really do engage the community, who take their concerns into consideration, who work with you in a respectful way? And so they said, well, here's a few of those folks. And so one of the groups was an organization called SAHA. They're located in Berkeley, and that was really helpful because at the time, just up the hill from us at Pacific School of Religion, they had looked to do a development there on their campus and had brought in a developer from Chicago, and the local neighborhood just ate them for lunch. And so it was really important for us to stay local. And so we talked to the folks from Saha, we brought them in, and they said, okay, here's what we think could happen with this place. And what's amazing to me is this was about 9 years ago. The conversation we had with those folks, with Eve and with Susan, the kind of outline of what they said was possible is still what we have today. And so we had this 3 set of possibilities that we brought to the congregation, we brought to our leadership body, and the question that we kept asking, who is our neighbor? And it was really challenging for some people on our leadership body particularly, so we got some free market capitalists who said, well, let's build the for-profit housing, and then let's just take the funds that come from that and help poor people. And I thought, well, I've heard a situation like this before, and why couldn't that money be just used for the poor? And I thought, well, I think we can do that, but we can do something more. And so we considered this over the course of at least a year. Congregational meetings, focus groups, work with our elected officials, work with our judicatory, our diocese, to determine what was the most faithful, fruitful way forward. And I'd be lying if I said it was like no, it was unanimous. It wasn't. I don't think these really challenging generational decisions, right? I mean, I think so. We've got a couple people here who were instrumental in this project. Our project manager Carrie's right over there. Our architect Paul's right over there. I think this is an 88-year deal. It will long outlast me and my successor and my successor's successor. And so these are really profound questions that you're doing. And as Landis said earlier, there are so many ways these can go wrong. And there are many ways they can go right. And the work you can do to care for your neighbor is pretty incredible. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But that was the foundational question, why this wasn't just a real estate deal for us, but really an act of faith and mission and ministry.
Thank you both. And so perfect segue to the next thing I wanted to ask, which is, in this room are many congregations who are about to embark on this development journey. And so I wanted to ask each of you, what are your key lessons learned at your stage of the process? I know, Dr. Agee, you're just breaking ground, and Father Phil, you've had folks in the development for quite some time now. And what do you wish someone had told you at the beginning of your journey?
I knew it was going to be a time-consuming project, but I just didn't know how much time and how consuming.
Could you say that again?
If somebody would have told me that it was really you are going to have to dedicate a time to this whole process. I did not know development. And the people, we bought our property in 2005, and we gave the sellers $1 million. Now you have to understand, the people that paid their tithes, offerings, and gifts of love were people that many of them came out of our programs, and many of them came to the things that we were serving in the community, feeding programs and that kind of stuff. Many of them came to us out of those programs. They did not have a lot of money, but yet we were able to give the sellers what they were asking for, which was $1 million, which was 25 million to us, but the Lord was able to help us to purchase the property. I was not going to move quick and just jeopardize what these people, grandmamas and grandfathers and single parents and children and young people who were contributing to this. This was their church. I was not going to just, move quick and not really look at every area so that we will serve the community, but also, do something for the church. And so I once I understood that it was going to take some dedication and some time, I just didn't know how much. And so we started meeting, I think about 7 years ago, and Tim is the project manager back there. It's like we're a family now. We meet every week, once a week. I've been meeting with these people every week. Some days it's Tuesday, some seasons it's Wednesdays, but it took that kind of commitment. I needed to be at all of those meetings because I was the people trusted me to build and to develop this, what we all agreed on. They trusted me, and so I was not going to take my hands off the plow until it's complete. And so if somebody would have told me, look, Pastor, it's not going to happen tomorrow quickly. It will happen if you just stay true to the course, but it's going to take your commitment. And so start and see the finish in and whatever it takes in order to do that. And so somebody would have told me that in the beginning, that would have been really, really more helpful to me. But I had already made up my mind I was going to stay the course and make sure that this project was not going to be just somebody doing something that is not according to what we believe God is saying to us, to provide affordable housing for seniors. And so I wish they had told me that.
I agreed 100%. I had no idea. I really didn't. I'm really glad that we are where we are, and I didn't realize the amount of attention and focus. My wife was probably the person who was most thrilled when Jordan Court was finally built. I can say that with certainty. Let's see, a few things learned. One is know your essentials. What is critical to whatever development deal you're going to make? For us, it was title to the land could not be at risk. And so we needed to be able to receive space in return for the use of the land. So the development deal that we have that, as I said, goes for 80 plus years is that we at All Souls are leasing the land to the project for $1 a year. And the valuation of that land allowed our partner, Saha, to build out space use for All Souls to use that the project then leases back to All Souls for $1 a year. Did I have that right? Good. So for us, it was critical that in 80-something years, the land come back to All Souls to do whatever our mission was going to be next. And I don't know what that will be. But I knew that was important to us, and not just us, right? We are part of a diocese, so the region for us in the Episcopal Church is most of the Bay Area, and so we were not our own decision makers on this. As we went through this process, another learning I had was know your constituencies. We had 5 of them, right? So we had the congregation, that the congregation had to be on board, and again, not unanimity, but there had to be consensus. Then we had our leadership body within the congregation, what we call a vestry. They were the decision makers. But over the course of the 7 years, that decision-making body turned over twice. So the people who started that process, who made that decision, were not there at the end by far. So that was the constituency we continued to have to communicate with. The third was the neighborhood. And I'd love to say that our neighborhood was unanimously in support of this, and I'd be lying. We did have, I think, a strong majority of folks, but there was a very vocal, wealthy, and in my opinion, entitled group of people who wanted to say what was going to happen in our shared spaces. So that was a third. Fourth was our diocese, our judicatory, so in this case, our bishop, and a body of people we have to have their permission to be able to do this work. And then the last is our elected officials. So for us, as our city council member, we happen to live in a very strange part of Berkeley where we have one city council member who is in our district, and then across the street is a second city council member, and across the other street is a third one. So we had to do a lot of work early on, but that paid dividends as the process went. So those were 5 constituencies we had to constantly be in conversation with and thinking about what are their needs, what are their concerns, what might be around the corner for them. So know your constituencies. Things that if I had thought about at the beginning, I wonder what could have happened next. We did not establish a separate 501c3 for the work we did. And I know that, for instance, some of our siblings across town at St. Paul AME, where Pastor Tony Hughes is, they have formed a separate 501c3 that allows them to be partners in the deal in a way that we are currently not. We went all the way to the very end, to the 11th hour with HCD, Housing Community Development for the state of California. And at the very, very end, they said, nope, you can't be a part of the partnership because they were worried that we were going to lease the project to ourselves and then at some point down the line say, you know what, thank you, state. We no longer want to do affordable housing. We're just going to take this for ourselves. If there had been a 501c3 separately, that might have been possible, and I know that happens in a number of partnerships. The last thing I'll say in this is similar to what Dr. Agee just said, which is I learned pretty early on that you have to believe in it deeply and hold it lightly. Because if you don't believe in it deeply, you will not make it. It is too long, it is too complex, it is too demanding. There were so many times, I think at least 8 different times, I thought we were done, it was finished, we were not going to get past this obstacle. One of the most ridiculous ones was in the city of Berkeley. We have a city ordinance that says you cannot cut down coastal live oak trees. Not only have you replaced them, if they're at least 6 inches in diameter, 6 inches I think, you can't cut them down. And there's only 2 exceptions. One is for a firehouse that they built, and the other is for the view in the Berkeley Rose Garden. Wah, wah. And so our city council member and our mayor, because we had these coastal live oaks that were too big to be cut down, we thought, what we're going to do? Well, they put in a resolution that says now any housing development in the city of Berkeley that has at least 50% or more units that are going to be affordable, you can cut down those oak trees. So that's just one little, obstacle that at the time seemed incredibly insurmountable. And if we didn't believe deeply in this ministry, and not just this deal, but the ministry of who is going to be able to be housed, we wouldn't have gotten any more. And that's why we have to hold it lightly, because there are so many twists and turns. And even though the bones of the deal held over the 7 years, there are so many things that we just had to let go of because it wasn't going to be feasible, wasn't going to be possible, whatever. And but we had to know what was essential and what would have been nice to have.
And following on those remarks, given the length and the complexity of this project, how did you keep that vision central and strong? What were some of the things that you did to continue momentum across all of these different changes and obstacles that you faced?
Amen. You have to know that, number one, that God is leading you in this direction. And so once we got clearance that this was something that God wanted us to do, and God shows it to us in a way that is really clear, then that settles it for me, because we ran into all kind of problems, as Father Phil just said, that ours was a bird. If it was a bird nest in the tree that needed to be cut down, then we could not cut it down, and the whole project would be stopped. And it's a timeline when you're talking about stacking money. If you don't meet those timelines, you lose that money. And so it was a bird nest. I mean, there's many times I wanted to, at 12 midnight, climb up in that tree, but we had to go through a process in order to get, to be able to move forward. But for us, it was, just really knowing that God, number one, is really with this. When we came back from Bible college, the Lord sent us back to Oakland with this word: go and repair the waste cities. Go and repair the waste cities. And so I knew he wasn't just talking about buildings, nails and wood, but I knew he was including nails and woods to repairing the waste cities. You start with the people, and then whatever the need is, you deal with it. And it just so happened we are a independent church, and so we don't have a hierarchical situation where we can receive support from, and so it's Junebug, Ray Ray, and Pookie and them that we deal with, and so it's we want to make sure that we are doing what is right, but also what is wise, and so I think the question was, say that again, Megan.
Oh, how could you speak about the ways that you were able to keep that momentum going and the vision strong? Because
in our meetings once a week, we ran up against all kind of problems. that would kill the program. But I knew my role to this whole development team was to keep everybody positive. Because most of the people who are a part of our team are extremely skilled in areas that they deal with. They are skilled. We got probably some of the best team members that you can have. Tim and CHDC, our funding consultant, our architects. We have a great team. They are professionals in what they do. But what I bring to the table is hidden. You can't see my help. And so I keep everybody focused. We'll have a problem. Well, we don't have enough money, and if we don't get this, I'll just say, okay, well, everybody stay positive. Do not start speaking negative, and then I'll just go and talk with my board of directors, which is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. We'll come back. I'll get the word that, hey, it's going to be all right. Don't worry about that. And I'll come back and say, it's going to be all right. Don't worry about that. And we got to a place, Tim can tell you, that one time we had too much money because it's some kind of systems that they go by, our consultant. And if you got too much money, you're penalized for it. And I had to go back to God and say, well, we got too much money now. And so that's what I bring to the table. And but we always got through each one of those sticking points. That the deal is going to die if we don't get. This is going to kill the deal. And we had probably 8 is the number of those kind of situations. But once you know from the beginning that God is the one that is saying to do it, we got the green light. The board of directors, the community wanted it. The city council people wanted it. It was being confirmed in so many different ways. Once we got that green light, we knew where there was a way, and we just had to stick with it, and our development team would always come up with a solution.
Yeah, I'll just echo some of that. I'll say that it was clear to me that the Holy Spirit is what we were following. We were not leading, we were following. And so that both within our neighborhood, folks that stepped forward to say, no, I'll help be a champion for this with the city council. I remember our first conversation was with our state senator and the mayor, and we said, what kind of affordable housing do you need? Is it for vets, for foster youth, for elders, for families? What do you need most? And they just said, yes, we need this housing. So whatever we can do to work with you, tell us. And we took them on their word for that. And so I feel like part of my role was to help people recognize where the Spirit was already moving. We're just getting on board. And I guess the metaphor for me is like if this was a car we were trying to drive from one place to the next, I was not the steering wheel. I was the clutch, right? I was helping engage all these different, keep things moving and keep the main thing as we're going along. And I completely agree, Dr. Agee. It's that positivity, that sense of hope, that sense of ways forward, as opposed to, okay, well, this is it. It's over. And I know that these developments can happen even with a change in the lead pastor. And there is, I think, if you're able to see it through, being able to be that constancy, right? That downbeat where the community, your partners, the city can know that there's a person that's helping push this forward. I think that helps it continue on. It can happen other ways, absolutely, but that can be really beneficial.
I hear so many sort of prophetic dimensions to this role, being in touch with God and being in touch with people, and thank you for that. We've talked a lot about the importance of relying on a team of experts. Can you talk about your process of building your team, how you selected your partners, how you maintain relationship with them. What part of your selection process worked well? What didn't? Any comments on that?
Yeah. That's an important question. All of them are very good questions. This is an important question because we are independent church, small church in the West Oakland area, and we believe in serving the community. So our energy has always been sort of outreach. We do believe in ministering to the family, the church family, but the church family is about reaching outside of the walls of the church, and so the church membership trusts the board of directors, and they trust me. My wife and I, we founded the church. We started it when we came back from Bible college. We started in our living room with a group of people, and then we stayed in the West Oakland area. We never moved out of the West Oakland area, and we just developed what God was showing us in the West Oakland area. And so many people in the West Oakland area feel that our church is their church, even though they may not come to our church, but they feel like it's their church. And so the development team was so critically important because I know what I bring to the table, and I didn't know all that I didn't bring to the table, but I realized once I got to the table, and if you ain't at the table, you're on the menu. And so I needed to be at the table. And so once I got to the table, I realized what I didn't know. This is major. Development is major. And so I went and did my research because, there is nothing that you don't have to be ignorant to now that we have the internet and Google and access to all of the books in every library on the internet. And so you can read up on stuff. And so I started talking to people, just kind of talking. Once we understood that this is the direction that we're going to go into, I started talking with people, and one of the meetings that I had was with Phil Neville. I don't know if anybody in here knew Phil Neville, who was the director over the Oakland Housing Authority. And so Phil, I asked for an appointment. He gave me an appointment for 45 minutes, and I came to that appointment, and I ended up meeting with him for 2.5 hours. I do not know why he talked with me about the things he talked with me about in this meeting. He told me all of the projects that was going on that needed the Oakland Housing Authority support. He knew all of the people, all of the players, everybody. And then he told me, he said, Pastor Agee, there are going to be, and these were the essentials that Phil was talking about. He said, there are 4 negotiating things that you need to remember. I had my notebook, I had my ink pen, and I left out of his office about maybe 15 pages of notes. He said, the number one thing you're going to have to realize, because, see, my thing is that I understood people were moving out. Some of my members were moving out. They were going to different cities close by. And Pastor Agee, we this is our church. We're going to be here. But, 3 or 4 months down the road, you see them, not as much as you used to see them. And so that is just the way it was. And I knew that it was changing, and we needed to do something. So one of the motivations was that we needed affordable housing, and another motivation was we needed to be able to sustain ourselves, and we needed to be able to do it not just with tithes, offerings, and gifts of love. We needed other systems that were coming to us, and so that was a motivation. And so Phil told me, He said, number one, when property transfer from title, that's a negotiating point. Well, we didn't want to transfer our property to title. We wanted to own the land, and so we weren't doing that. But he said that was a negotiating point. He said the other negotiating point is the developer fee. That is a negotiating point. He said you got to know these negotiating points. And then the other negotiating point was to manage, once the project is complete, to manage the asset. That's a negotiating point that you don't want to just let get past you. And then the other one is that in 15 years after the tax credit time is over with, you want to make sure that you have first rights of refusal. So I knew that, and when I left out of there, I knew that, wow, these are points that I need to be aware of. And so I needed someone that would represent me, and it's called an owner's rep. After I talked with a whole bunch of people, so I ended up talking with Landis. He didn't know I was going to mention his name, but Landis became our owner rep. He represented, guided us through each of those negotiating points so that we were able to get all of the things that we needed in the deal. At the same time, all of the things that the developer needed, because when I believe it's supposed to be win-win and not just somebody win and you lose. You know, the church is to be empowered, to be raised up, and the benefit while you serve in the community. And Landis, he helped us to not only negotiate all of those negotiating points, and he's not the attorney, but he understands the whole process, and we were able to get through that whole process and get what we needed in order to develop the 50 units that we wanted. And he also helped us to develop the team, because he's in that field. And so the team that we have really is Landis giving us, he knew our developer, he knew the architect, he knew the people who were the funding consultants, he knew all of those. And so, and I told him when we first entered into a contract, I said, I know you're bishop. And if you do me wrong, I told him, I said, if you do me wrong, I'm going to tell on you. I told him, I said, I'm going to tell on you. He's a man of integrity. I'm telling you, he is. I didn't have to tell Bishop or anything. He's a man of integrity. I trust this brother. And so, but it's so important to have a team that you understand, they understand your needs, you understand their needs, and you guys are working together and become really a family, providing something for a community. Yes.
All I'll add to that is what we looked for were, did this partner share our values? For one of the images I had was the image of the Apostle Paul when he talks about Christian marriage, where you don't want to have mismatched oxen, right? You don't want to have your partner pushing really hard in this direction and you're going that way. And so that was really critical for us, and we found that in Saha. I believe it was providential, the way that relationship came together. It was very clear that they shared the same way of doing the work as well as the end goal of the work. What we did not know, because I did not have a conversation with Phil Neville, unfortunately for us, I didn't know that the developer's fee was negotiable. I wish I'd met Landis much earlier. So that's something to consider and to think about, because by the time that was already, we became aware of that, the deal had been done. And so that's something that you just need to know, those points of negotiation. You need to have somebody alongside you who knows the field. We were very fortunate that the folks we worked with shared our values, and they worked well with us, but the working out, the living out of it is also another piece, because I know another Episcopal church here in the Bay Area that is having a really hard time because the common area management charges, for instance, are something that they had not fully anticipated. And it is really challenging for their operational budget. They know they're doing God's work. There's no doubt about that. But the challenges of meeting those charges month by month and year by year are more than they expected. And so there's those ways of working out. For us, we knew we did not want to manage the apartments. There are 34 studio units for seniors, so 62 years and older. 12 of those units are set aside for No Place Like Home. So it's for elders who've been living on the streets with serious mental illness. And so stacking, right? As we have, ours was, it's kind of obscene. It was $24.5 million project. It's just unbelievable to me that this is what it takes to build affordable housing. So it was about 12 million in 4% low income tax credit units from the feds. And then the city of Berkeley for 5 million, the county of Alameda, thanks to the A1 bond measure, about 6 million, and then 2.5 from the state of California, that was with the No Place Like Home funds. And so you just have to find people, it's critical that you trust the people you're doing this with, because you're gonna come up to these points where you just don't know a way forward, or it doesn't meet with your expectations, and then you have to find a way to navigate it together. And all that, at every different step with the different agencies. And this is not something I went to seminary for. I'm not trained as a developer. I'm not trained as a property manager. And so we made sure that we found the folks that we felt like could do it effectively and faithfully. And like very few people in the neighborhood know the name Saha, right? So they developed the property and they're now managing it for us, but they know our name. And so when something's happening, they don't necessarily call the property manager, they call me. And I listen to them and then I say, all right, there's a property manager that you can talk to. But that's also, I think, the piece that we bring to this, which is trust. Because we have in our case, we've been in that neighborhood since 1904. And so we have hopefully developed over these decades the trust of the people around us, the elected officials, for how we can work alongside. And if you don't have trust, it just doesn't happen.
And my final question for you today is, where have there been unexpected moments of hope and grace in this process?
Throughout. I mean, each step of the way, the unexpected moments of hope. I like that question. It's been throughout the whole time of us starting. We went through the entitlement phase, that was maybe a 2-year process. And then we went through the funding phase where we had to get all of the money before we can actually break ground. And it was $53 million for us. And that's $1 million a door. That's affordable housing. These are 1-bedrooms. And so I'm believing for another source of funding so that we can not have to stack, we can just build. And so I was telling Tim, he said, well, there's, and I said, well, I don't know about that. It's got to be some money somewhere where we can just build without stacking it, because there's too many requirements once you get that outside money. But like I said earlier, that there was times where we didn't have enough money, and there was something that happened, and where there was a source of money. Like one time we lost $1 million because of something, and the city of Oakland, they took back the money that we were qualified to get, and so the next year they came up with the same amount of money, but only 400,000 more. And so I told the team, I said, because they said, well, we're going to go, Tim is right back there. He said, we're going to go for the million. I said, no, let's go for all of it. Ask for it all. And so we asked for it all. That was a source of hope for me, because it just was God showing us each step of the way that he is there. He is with us, and that, I wasn't afraid of, no, that's all our money. I'm charging interest on them taking that $1 million from us. This is $400,000 interest. And so ask for it all, and we got it all. We got it all. And so just different things like that. Knowing that God is with you in it, you have to know that, because there's going to be many opportunities for you to just, it ain't gonna happen, and so, but just know that he's there, and the whole goal is for me being here today is that the church be empowered with the service that you do. And so affordable housing and development of housing will empower the church to keep on serving in a way, hopefully, that you're not depending upon just tithes, offerings, and gifts of love, but you have a resource of funding that's in your own control, that you can serve the community the way God is putting it in your heart to do it.
Again, yes. I'd say for me, the moments, well, there were many, and they seem to come just at the point of greatest challenge. We started this project before we were just at the start of the wave that's been building now for the last several years as our city, county, and state governments have realized the crisis that we've been in. And so what happened for us was we still had to go through the traditional entitlement process, which in the city of Berkeley means we need to go before the Zoning Adjustment Board. And the moments of unexpected hope, one of them was when, we had the small group of neighbors who was upset about the project, and so they were prepared to push back against anything. And then we had another neighbor show up who had not come to any of our open meetings that we'd had with the neighborhood. And so I kind of held my breath as she began to speak. She says, I live in the neighborhood, I'm an architect, and I fully support this. I think this is exactly what we need to have in our neighborhood. And I have a little bit of constructive feedback about your design. And she was the one who said the door on the corner needs to be a double height. And that's the way it looks now. That's how Paul designed it, because of that feedback that we got that day at the Zoning Adjustment Board. And for the final vote, the chair of the board said, you know what, I'm Jewish. And he said, but you're doing God's work. And then so we're moving along, and the other unexpected moment of hope came when a parishioner came to me and said, I have a friend who used to go to church, doesn't go to church anymore, and had asked me about, where do you, I hear you talking about church, where do you go to church? Oh, I go to church at All Souls up on the corner of Cedar and Spruce. And she said, is that the one where you just built that affordable housing? I said, yeah. He said, no, that's a church. And I thought, okay, she may never come through our doors to worship with us, but we have helped her see what God's mission can be in our neighborhood, in our city, and other people can follow that.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for being here. Landis, do you want me? I was going to offer folks to ask some questions. Do we have time for that? So I think Elisa Marquez is not going to be able to join us today, or she is here? No. Oh, Bishop's. Okay, great. So if folks have questions, feel free to come up here, and I will give you the mic to ask them if we have a few questions. So about 15 minutes. Yeah, Landis can. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Chip Kohler from the Episcopal Church of St. Anne's in Fremont. My question is for Dr. Phil, or Reverend Phil. So after 88 years, what happens? What's the vision of what happens on the 88th year with the building and the residents? And
Great,
so on?
sorry, great question. So the way the contract is written is that the building and land will then come back to All Souls to be used for whatever comes next. Many years ago, I lived in New York, and the Archdiocese of New York was going to close down a school and a church. And the newspaper reporter asked the Archdiocese, well, are you gonna sell this? And the Archdiocese spokesperson said, no, I think we're gonna need this in the next 300 years. Oh, it's always stuck with me because this is not something just for today, tomorrow, or 20 or 30 years. Like, this is something that we believe in 88 years that All Souls will still want to be seeing what the mission is, and so we'll have the ability to do that.
Good morning. I'm Lena Robinson with Sanctuary Homes. So I may have missed the first part because wouldn't you know, the devil is always busy. And as I got on the freeway to come here, the check engine light came in on my car and it started rocking. So I took it to the mechanics, but I said, you're not going to stop me. So I got on board, and I'm so happy to be here today. So my question, I said that to say I may have missed this, but my question is two-part. First of all, did you have to acquire the land, or was it already land that was part of your church property? Number one. Number two, generally speaking, in these kinds of deals, some kind of equity is required from the sponsor, the church that sponsors it. If you've spoken to that, would you just mind repeating those facts again? Thank you.
Praise the Lord. I didn't speak to that, and so, but that's a good question. We had the church that we were using. It was first a mortuary, and so we converted the mortuary into our church, and so we bought it, and many people in the community buried their relatives from that place, and so many of them never came to us. And so about 15 years ago, my brother, who is a real estate appraiser, we were just standing outside of the church building talking about some other stuff, and he just looked at the price. He said the highest and best use for this land is affordable housing for seniors. We are half a block away from the senior center. We're catty-cornered across from the Farmery Park. We're directly across the street from the West Oakland Library, and the 88 bus it stops right on our side. And so that was just a seed that was just deposited on the inside of me. So when we bought the land in 2005, we had control of that land, and the building was put up in 1975. So it was cinder brick, which really was restrictive in a lot of ways, and so we wanted to try to remodel it, but that was not feasible, and so we ended up saying that, okay, let's tear it down. Let's provide something for the community at the same time, provide a newer building to worship God in. And that's exactly what we were able to do in our development phase, our developing of the MOU that we ended up with the developer. We have a sanctuary that's twice the size of what we had, and we also are able on the land to build 50 affordable units for seniors. And so we did, because we had equity in the property, we contributed a set aside of $1.7 million to the project. And that is also dedicated money. Once all of these stuff is paid, we get a residual, we get money for the land that we still own as a part of the project. And so I hope that answers your question.
For us, it's similar. We purchased the property that was directly adjacent to the church that from this Episcopal Order of Monks. And for our deal, it's the equity is the land, the value of the land that we received back in the building out of space use for us. And so we don't get residual income from it, but we are able, in our case, to house our staff members there, which is a benefit to our operating budget because then that's part of their compensation.
Good morning. My name is Steve Schwartz. I'm with the Interfaith Food Collaborative. So first, I really appreciated this. And for the two reverends, I mean, you've been called, you're dedicated, you're passionate about this, but you talked about how much time it took. And I'm thinking of churches where pastors retiring in a couple of years, they're losing members. If they feel like a project's going to take a lot of the senior clergy's time, that can be a deal breaker from the start. So have you seen examples where other congregations found a way to delegate?
Yeah, I have. A church out in Walnut Creek, an Episcopal church, the senior pastor kind of led that push. And there was a dedicated group of members of that congregation who gave themselves to that over years and consistently meant to do that. But you can't do that without somebody from your congregation devoting themselves to it. Because what Landis described earlier can easily happen where people with other interests in mind can steer things away from what is also in the best interests of the congregation, right? Because it's absolutely possible for this to be a win-win-win. A win for the congregation, a win for those who need housing, a win for the city, a win for the neighborhood. I mean, it's all possible, but you need a group of people who are going to keep their attention, their focus on that for a long period of time.
Yeah, and the negotiating points would be helpful because there are things that can, for that retiring pastor, things that could be set aside even in those negotiating points where it's either the developer fee and or the residual income that may be coming to the church. And so there are things that can be set up in that in the beginning. You don't want to do it at the end. You want to do it right at the beginning because everybody needs to know. It has to be transparent to everybody so that everybody sign off on it. But you negotiate all that in the beginning.
Reverend Dr. A.G. Father Phil, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And with that, we're going to bring up Bishop Macklin. Well, Landis first.
So we're going to be transitioning to a break. So a supervisor, Elisa Marquez, was on the program. She called me yesterday. They had to move her supervisor's meeting to the same time where it was not scheduled at this time, so she sends her apologies. So we do have a break coming up. Bishop Macklin's going to come up and share a little bit about the Glad Tidings story. We'll transition to the break, and then we will move into a different type of the program where we start getting into the technical support that you will need.
Thank you very much. We will not be long at all here. I'm sorry that Elise could not make it with her schedule change. She is our new supervisor, the latest one that went on that took the place of, what was our supervisor? Richard Valle, who was so helpful to us. But we were so glad to get her on. She's from 94544. That's our zip code. All right? And we were happy to have somebody from our zip code end up on the as a supervisor for Alameda County. For that, we're grateful. My son is going to share just a brief message on screen because I think that's probably the most effective way to fill just a few minutes of time, and I'll let that tell our story. So either he's coming back or he's someplace, and he's going to roll that as soon as he's here. I don't know whether he's doing it from in there or upstairs, and we'll have a chance to do that. I do remember there were 3 people who were working on a project similar to this, and they were trying to get the bids out to figure out what everybody's going to do. So they asked one person, they said, "So, sir, why are you here?" He said, well, I'm a graduate of Harvard, and I've been trained in economic development, this, that, and the other, and he goes through his whole thing. And it's a very impressive resume. So he asked somebody else, he said, well, I'm from MIT, and I am a professional at building. I am an engineer. I can tell you how long it's going to take to go this way. I can tell you what this is going to be. I can tell you how much the cost is going to be. And I think I should have this project. They finally asked the other guy, poor fellow who was a preacher. And they said, so, sir, what are you doing here? He said, well, I didn't go to MIT. I didn't go to Harvard. And I don't know anything about building. And I can't tell you anything about this, that, or the other. He said, what are you doing here? He said, well, I'm just the guy that climbs up the tree, looks back, and tells everybody down there, you went the wrong way. And so your being here means that very much. I will just tell you this as he sets this up, and then I think the video is only 7 or 8 minutes, so it's not very long. That when we came to Glad Tidings, I heard them mentioning about the drug situation. We had purchased the other church around the corner. We were moving, we were growing. Crack cocaine came and changed everything. The church kept growing, and at a certain point, a few years down the road, as we got through that, or was going through that, it was getting really bad back on this side of the street. Tennyson still looked the same, but everything behind it was just terrible. And I remember the congregation, we met, we started having those meetings, and everybody, we got to get out of here, got to get out of here, got to get out of here. This place is going crazy. And we went through a spiritual exercise that we call a consecration. And at the beginning of the year, and that's where you fast for 3 days. Okay? And I know that's probably new for a lot of people, but anyway, it's called fasting and prayer. Okay? Where you don't eat, that kind of fast. All right? Some fasting now is not being on the internet for 2 days. But anyway, another story. And I remember coming out of that weekend, and it was raining so bad outside. It was just pouring down. And that Sunday morning, and the congregation was waiting for me to say something, and the Lord told me to get up and start walking. So I went outside without my umbrella. I'm just getting drenched, and I just started walking. And I just walked 1 block that way, 1 block this way, 1 block this way, 1 block that way. And I heard the Lord speak to me and say, every place the sole of your feet touch, that's yours. So when I got back into the sanctuary, everybody was waiting for me to say, okay, we're moving to Fremont, we're moving to Union City, we're getting out of here. And I stood up and I said, folks, we're not going anyplace because the Lord spoke and said, light shines brightest where it's darkest. And with that in mind, we're going to set roots here, we're going to build here. But before we could build, we had to deal with what was going on in the community, which meant we had to deal with all of the drugs and the crime and everything else. But that problem really became our ministry opportunity. And through the ministry opportunity, God opened other doors. And so it meant we did a lot of ministry out here at midnight, where we would bring our men out on the street when all the other men were out on the street as well. And had a chance to talk that. Sonny, is that ready to go? Okay. And so that's kind of where that started at. So when we don't have time, we normally give this tour with our buses or either our golf carts. We've got, I think, 3 of them, and we put people on the carts and we take them all around the neighborhood. But perhaps on your way out, when you're leaving today, you might want to drive a block this way, and you'll see Glad Tidings Arms on this side. You'll see Spring Court on that side. Spring Court is 32 apartments there. Somebody built them, turned them into condos, but they couldn't sell them, so they had to come back to Glad Tidings. And we took all the young couples that got married the last 2 years, and I said to all of them, you're getting ready to buy a condo. I want every one of you. And I put 16 people in there all at the same time for $100,000 apiece. Later, they sold them and had enough money to buy houses. So, son, whenever you tell me to go, we'll move in that direction. So you'll come down, you go to Glad Tidings Arms on that side. You'll see a new house on the other side that was built by the church. You'll see another house that the church was involved in. You'll see the 32 units there. If you keep going down the street, you're going to see at the very end of the street, across Tennyson, you'll see 12 units over there called Lancelot Court. You'll see 2 parking lots that are there that once had housing. At least one of them did. The other one on the corner was owned by, and Chevron Oil had the responsibility of cleaning it up. They did not. And it was a David Goliath thing, and we took on Chevron and brought them back to the neighborhood and reminded them of their sins.
Let's give a round of applause again for Megan, Reverend Phil, and Reverend A.G. for just being very gracious with their time and their stories. So both of them talked about the importance of a team. And we felt it just appropriate to start introducing you to some of the key elements of who that team should be. Feel free to talk to any of these folks on your own, get their contact information. Everyone on the program we trust. HKIT is also back here as an architect firm, and Paul, we trust them as well. So what we're going to do is bring up an architect and a financial consultant, Rita Raj from Dahlin, and Diana Dalton from Affordable Housing Finance Consultant, Community Economic Developments. So Community Economic Developments. And, here's some steps here. Whatever is easier. Okay, yeah. Thank you. And what we're going to get into for you are some of the technical aspects of development and roles. I'm going to play the role of an owner rep, and I will facilitate this conversation from the perspective of the church. And having done a lot of this work as a member of the ministry, as a board member in the ministry, I understand both sides. So I understand the professional side, but I also understand intimately the ministry side. It's kind of where I spend most of my time and energy. And so as an owner's rep, and that's the work that we do for churches, you really, if you are not, so in a ministry like Glad Tidings, there's just a lot of skills and experience, a lot of domain expertise in the congregational body. So there aren't too many things that Bishop Macklin just can't reach into the congregation and pull those talents out and put them right to work. I mean, pretty much anything that carpenters, engineers, doctors, architects, consultants, executives, but a lot of ministries don't have that internally. And you heard a contrast between the previous conversation about, on one hand, they both had success. Pastor Agee did a lot of research early on, and Reverend Phil acknowledged he wished he had known a few things early on that he learned later in the process. And we always believe that starts with an owner's rep. And that's a fancy way of just saying someone who represents the church's best interest in that relationship. And it's more than just a volunteer project manager. It's someone who also understands technically real estate development and housing development and all the different various disciplines. And if you don't have that, I recommend that you spend time identifying someone that you can then borrow or hire for that. And look into your relationships. Look into who's doing things in the community. And there are great folks all around us that are in the for-profit world or in the nonprofit world. And from our experience, they're happy to get involved with the right person. It's a heart and it's a mind type of work. So having that owner's rep, we believe, is critical, because at the very beginning of the process, and that's why we're starting with this panel, we like to call it, is there a there there? What you don't want to do is spend a lot of time and resources chasing down a vision that just may not be feasible for different reasons. And we always seek to preserve the resources of the ministry, with that financial resources as well as human resources. So if there's a vision for housing, we need to make sure that that vision is viable when it comes to housing development in particular. And so, like I said, we call that, is there a there there in our shop? And two of those critical components are just feasibility of the physical capacity for the site itself, and all that entails the practical design elements and things like that, which we're going to get into, and then the financial piece. We've heard a lot about capital stacking in that early conversation, and everything takes financial resources. And so both Rita Raj and Diana are going to be able to help us understand what those parts and components are in this discussion. And we always believe that that's where you should start. So as an example, One of our clients had 2 different sites that they wanted to develop housing on. They own those sites. And to a layperson, real estate is real estate. Why can't I just build there? There seems to be enough land there. So it makes sense to me to be able to build. I see the land. Why can't I put housing? I see housing across the street. Well, there are different fundamentals that may be that need to come to bear during that process. You know, is there access? What does the zoning have to say? And all those other nuances that we really want to understand up front before you're spending money and time if there's no feasibility. So let's first start off with, would you like to introduce yourself, Diana, and what you do?
Sure. I'm Diana Downton. I'm a financial consultant with Community Economics. And we have been around for over 40 years. We're a nonprofit organization that works as a consultant to nonprofit affordable housing developers. And so we work throughout the state on projects throughout the state of California as well as in some other states. And we've worked with a wide range of nonprofit developers. I see CHCC in the room who we work with, and many others. And our focus, you know, we work on all different types of affordable rental housing, primarily assisting developers who are using the low-income housing tax credit program, which is the biggest financing program for affordable housing development that we have available to us. So that's a little bit about me.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Hi, I'm Rituraj. I'm a principal with Dolan Group. We're an architecture and planning firm based out of Pleasanton. Our focus is mostly on housing and community building. So we do everything from market rate, but there's a large percentage of work that we do with school districts, you know, churches, and doing affordable housing also with affordable clients. Here in Hayward itself, I think we did the Eden building, which is the headquarters in like downtown. We're working on the meta housing on, you know, Hayward and 2 more other affordable projects, you know. So it's really interesting to see this, you know, because we are starting to see a lot of interest, you know, because the passion is there. It's always been how to get there, right? We're starting to see it. So I think I have to say there's God and there's also a little bit of Sacramento help. The state's really helping in terms of the process. So in the last 2 years, some of the issues that I think the previous panel talked about might have got a little bit easier in terms of entitlement. The cost is still there. The other problems are still there, but some of the process is getting a lot more simpler, and we can talk about it later.
So we're going to discuss affordable housing, subsidized affordable housing. Not all churches or ministries want to go in that direction. Some want to do market. Some want to do mixed income. So the fundamentals are still the same for the most part in terms of is there a there. But where we begin this journey. So we heard about the vision and the patience and all those perspectives from the ministry, but where do you start? We always start with getting the vision down on paper, right? And the first call that we will typically make is to Rituraj. I'll most likely say, hey, I have 3 addresses. And then he'll ask me a question about density. And then we'll talk about, can you fit something on paper? So maybe you can just express, so someone in the room says, we want to build housing. Here's our site. What do we do? So walk us through your thought process at a high level of what you're thinking as an architect and what you're solving for on paper. And not just from capacity and the basics.
I think fundamentally, we do like to go back a little bit behind, like, you know, you've got a site, right? You already know what you want. I think fundamentally for us, it's very important to understand what your values are. We did talk about it in the previous panel because the process does get longer. Let's say if I do something and it works out with what you want to build on the site, right? The process is longer. So as long as the entire consultant team and, you know, the ownership is on the same value, because like we can adjust things based on the value as long as our goal is set. So I think that's fundamentally very important for us even before we start to paper, because we want to know why you want to build it, you know, and why you want to do it, because that's fundamentally very important. Because invariably we felt the wish list is always very big. Once we start getting things to paper, sometimes you can put all that, but it might just mean that the building has to be much more taller, right? And that also implies like there might be certain cost associated with it. But at the same time, I think we can look at a site, we can look at the zoning, what the city would allow. As I said, there's state laws now which allow certain things to be taken advantage of. We can come from a spatial and land capacity to say, yes, you can get this many units, and it does depend. If you're doing senior housing, you're looking at primarily one-bedroom apartments, right? If you're looking at family, especially when it comes to subsidized housing, there are certain state rules that you have to have a certain number of units which are 2 bedrooms, certain number of units which are 3 bedrooms, and certain number of units which are 1 bedroom. So there are certain rules that have to be followed. So that does impact on the same site. If you're looking at it for maybe seniors housing, traditional housing, you might get more units. If you're looking at it from a family housing, you might get less units. And there's similar implications with parking. Seniors might require less parking, but maybe families might require at least a little bit more parking. So there are a little bit push and pulls and what you can get on the site. So when Landis calls, we kind of look at it from a spatial standpoint, what the zoning would allow, a little bit of, hey, this is what the state law allows, so this is where the process might go, and this is what you can get in this kind of a building. And that would be the first step, and also these are the facilities we might get in those.
So staying in that vein, churches have vision. How do you work with them to help them understand what's practical? So when do trade-offs and compromises take place in that process? One thing that is important is as you're going through this, you have to be able to give your architect clear direction. And one thing we learned from Pastor Agee, he's at that table. And I spoke earlier, developers are critical components of the process, obviously, because they're going to build it and operate it. But we want you not just at the table passively. We want you at the table as an active partner. So your ability to help shape this early conversation is critical. So how do you want them to work with you? And then how do you help them understand what you can and can't do, what the site can and cannot do?
Yes, I think for us, from our side, our options are to give the best possible options, right? We've also realized from the church side, the ownership side, it's always helpful if you can get a small group that we can regularly talk to. Maybe it's like a task force. Maybe it might be folks who are slightly involved with the development side, so they understand a little bit of the pros and cons of the options being offered, because it always, time is money a little bit, especially when you're talking about subsidized funding, there's certain timings you have to hit with every funding cycle. So if you don't make it in this cycle, then you have to wait for your project maybe for the next funding cycle, right? So I think it always is helpful if you have a smaller task force that we can actually more regularly meet. It can be a slightly more technical discussion, right? And maybe there's a larger group we meet on a slightly more deferred schedule where we can kind of bring back the things that we've talked about. We're working on a project, where we fit all the things that was required, but it kind of transferred into 3 buildings. That meant it was much more expensive. Then once we talked about all the facilities, we could actually share some of the facilities between the community and the church, and then it became to us it was just a different way of looking at it, but it still needed a little bit of back and forth to understand why was the space needed, how's it being used, right? Is it being used all days a week? So I think that's kind of the value. I think there's a little bit, it is an iterative process, and sometimes, that's where the value always becomes important, is what you're trying to get to at the end of it, because, you might have thought about it as one big building. It might be actually 3 smaller buildings because it's cheaper to build, but now you have a shared community space with maybe the larger community, right? So
one more question. How important is it for them to already know what they want? So do you want them to come to you with a concrete vision, or do you want them to come to you with a concept, or you just want them to come to you with an open mind and have a general discussion? From a best practice, where is it best for them to enter into the conversation with you?
I think it is best if you really know what you want. If you want to provide affordable housing, but your population that you want to serve is open, then I think we might look at hey, if you provide seniors, we might be able to provide more housing. If you provide transitional, maybe it might be even smaller, right? You might get more units. But if your community need is really a family housing and like that's what you want to serve, I think we can kind of give the options. But I think from our perspective, I think we're still a little bit technical. We are passionate about, providing housing, but I think it is helpful a little bit for us if you exactly know the community that you want to serve, because then we can also provide the best options to navigate through that process, and also what kind of best should be in that building and in the surroundings that could serve that community.
Is it important to stay the course? So you start laying out the vision, and then now there's a bunch of change because there's different ideas. How does that impact you?
It's a little bit of time. As long as the overall vision doesn't change, I think the rest of it is superficial. It's like, there'll always going to be negotiations, once somebody, like you get a partner in place, and there might be, cost implications of doing certain things. There's also state laws about providing a certain space for community rooms, laundry sizes, and all that stuff. But I think as long as the vision is there, we're providing, let's say, we want to provide 100 units of affordable housing. If we end up with 98 because of the cost factor and all that stuff, it's still, we've kind of done good work.
So Diana, we get this picture from the architect, and then how do we pay for it? So there's two schools of thought that I typically see. I'll see where the program is set. Pastor Agee knew he wanted to do senior housing. Other times, they're more entrepreneurial. Oh, there's funding for this type of housing, so maybe I'll do more vets, or maybe I'll do this other vulnerable population. In your role, how do you typically enter into the team?
I actually would have some similar comments in terms of, I think it's preferable if you come to the table with your vision already in mind, but be flexible and know that as you're going through the process, you may discover other funding opportunities that might shift your vision. So I would say, come in with a vision, and that's our preference. We don't like someone to say, well, we want to build 45 units. Tell us what'll work. You're going to be in this project for a while. You want to be passionate about it. You want to be able to sell it to your community as well, and your financing partners. So coming in with a vision, I think, is great. But the reality is that the financing sources do have a lot of requirements. They have a lot of criteria that they use for determining who's going to get the financing that may be related to population targeting, or maybe the income levels that you're serving. So some flexibility is important, but I would say, I discourage people from saying, oh, there's some money for veterans out here. Okay, we can serve veterans. I think if you need to know that that's what you want to do, and that there are people, there's a need for that population targeting.
So this conversation we're having prior to engaging a developer. So we're around the table at the church, and we're having a conversation about we want to get into housing. So after we get ourselves aligned, we're going to call the architect just to say, what do you think? We have a site. Does this site have the potential to create the type of housing we want? So he's going to have some iterations. He's going to meet with us, and he's going to come back and say, I can fit 100 units. I can fit 50 units. And he's going to give us some of those concepts. The next conversation is now we're looping in Diana, because now we need to understand where the numbers lie. So we call that a pro forma, but she's going to explain to us what a pro forma is, and she's going to explain to us how that's built, and then she's going to talk about why that's important to know up front before we start signing development agreements and forming LLCs and running out and talk to city officials and community members. So we now know we want to build a certain type of housing at a certain location, and we have a clear understanding physically that the land can't support our vision, but we don't know how we're going to pay for it. So can you explain to us what a pro forma is, and then what goes into that process? And what are the things that you're doing to say this property makes money or it doesn't make money, or it's going to be tough to fund it, or it's going to take us 15 years, or it's going to, just kind of bring us into that conversation with you now that we know that we can actually physically build a site. We want to know if we can pay for it.
Sure. So the financial pro forma is essentially a model that we're using to look at the financing of the project, both from the perspective of what you'll need to build it, and then the perspective of what you're going to need to operate it over time, and how to make both of those work. So it's a model. It doesn't predict the future necessarily, but there's standard criteria that lenders or investors will use for underwriting projects. So when you set up your financial pro forma, you want to use those same assumptions that your future financing partners will be using. So generally, we'll start with the operating side and look at how many units do you think you'll have? What population, what unit sizes are you going to have? What income targeting are you going to have? And then we'll look at what are the estimated operating expenses? And so, some of these, especially early on, you're estimating, you're looking at similar properties. If you have a developer you're working with, they'll help you look at some similar properties to look at operating expenses and things like that. And so this is where we might have a reality check moment on the operating side. If you say, we want to serve 100% homeless population, and we want to give them all these services, and we're gonna when we try to run those numbers, I don't think it's going to work. So we need, because the tenants, homeless residents, are not going to pay much rent. The services costs are high. So when we look at the ability of the property to support that type of population and revenue expenses over time, it's not going to work. So we might say then, well, maybe you can get some rental subsidies to bring to the table from the housing authority. Or maybe you can serve a wider range of income population. So we'll look at options to make that operations scenario work. Occasionally, you end up with a property that actually generates enough revenue so that you can support maybe a mortgage on the property. So we'll look at that. Can you support some kind of a permanent loan on the property that will help finance the development side? So first we'll look at operations, and then we start looking at sources and costs. So sources and uses piece of the pro forma. And so the costs, we're a financial consultant. We don't do estimating. So you'll need to bring, you'd need to bring some costs to the table, some estimated costs for constructing the property, architect, insurance, things like that. And then, we'll look at, okay, how much is it going to cost? And then we'll start putting together the sources. Do you want me to go through some of those sources now? Okay. So I mentioned in the beginning, one of the largest sources that any developer who's doing affordable housing, rental affordable housing is using these days is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, sometimes called LIHTC. So the tax credit program is actually a federal program. The federal government allocates these tax credits to the states, and then the states allocate those to developers who apply through the tax credit allocation committee. Or, yeah, there's lots and lots of acronyms. It's a huge alphabet soup. So I'll try not to use the acronyms. But so the low-income housing tax credit program is really one of the reasons why people like me are why anyone works with someone like me on these developments. Ideally, you wouldn't need a financial consultant to help you put together this financing, but unfortunately, it's pretty darn complicated. So the tax credit program is, the concept behind it is that you apply for these tax credits, but you're a nonprofit developer, so why do you need tax credits? That doesn't do you any good. So you sell those tax credits to an investor. Usually that's a bank, or it's a syndicator who puts together banks to purchase these tax credits, and then they give you money up front to develop your property, and over time they become a partner in your development. Over time they get these tax credits and they're happy because they've gotten these tax credits, and you're happy because they've given you a whole lot of capital to build your housing development. So that's the big chunk that's that we will help you model when we're putting together a pro forma, because there's some technical stuff around modeling how much tax credit equity you can get when you receive the tax credits. So, but that's not going to cover your whole development cost, unfortunately. Maybe that's 40% of your development cost. There's also two different kinds of low-income housing tax credits. There's 9% and 4%. I won't bore you with that right now. So then we've already looked at, we've modeled your tax credits. Then we look at, well, were you able to leverage some kind of a perm mortgage? When we looked at the cash flow, maybe you can get a loan from a bank that will help to finance the capital development. And then probably that still doesn't cover your whole gap. So this becomes the gap that we're trying to fill. And this is where we pull together every possible source on the planet to try to fill the gap. And so often that involves local financing. So maybe your city, your county have various sources that they've put together, either maybe federal home funds or CDBG, or they've had maybe a ballot, a proposition, a bond measure that they've been able to have passed where they have some resources. So there's county, local funds. They usually have an application process for those. And then there's funding at the state level, which is through the Department of Housing and Community Development primarily. And that's a whole alphabet soup, again, of different programs. So affordable housing, sustainable communities, multifamily housing program. So then we'll, as part of the putting together the pro forma, we'll try to figure out, which financing sources might be a good fit for your project. And then we'll also revisit, again, there's this flexibility component on your vision. We'll revisit, well, you really need this many 3-bedroom units to score maximum points for blah-de-blah. And you need, you need a certain number of homeless targeted units to compete for this other source. So that's also what we help folks do to put together the pro forma. So that's both kind of what the pro forma is and how we go through the process of the initial putting it together.
How competitive are these sources?
Extremely competitive. Yeah, so they're very competitive. We have to be very focused on, how you're going to score. What are your chances for receiving the funds? Unfortunately, lately, just funding has been extremely oversubscribed, And this is my chance to put in like a really big plug for some of the initiatives that may be on the ballot coming up this year, because thank you. Because some of the sources that we've been using for the last few years were through a state housing bond, and this is a lot of the funds that are available through the State Department of Housing and Community Development. Those are running out. In fact, they've run out, basically. So there's going to be some bonds on the ballot coming out, both a regional bond and a state bond. I'm hoping all those will actually be on the ballot. So another initiative to change the voter thresholds for these types of bonds. So I also just want to emphasize that this is really critical for people to get involved in these efforts, because it's going to be crucial to get those passed so that we have the resources that we need. Because as was implied, there's a real shortage of financing. So you have to be prepared for that as well. It's very competitive, and it may take a while to put together the financing you need.
Is there a threshold where for a project to be competitive, it needs to have at least X units where it starts to make sense financially? And this, under that number, is just really hard to build financial momentum or even be competitive. Is there like a sweet spot for a minimum unit threshold?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say the developers might have a little bit of a better sense than the financial consultant, but I would say that like below 50 units is going to be tough. Yeah, and that's both for competitiveness for financing as well as operationally. You have certain kind of fixed costs, both on the development side and on the operations side. So when you have a smaller property, the economies of scale aren't working for you. So I know, a lot of folks just kind of say 50 is as low as they'll go.
Yeah, I think I can speak a little bit from the management side. It's generally 40 has been the threshold because you do need an on-site manager. There's certain obligations, and also once you start crossing 120 or something like that, then you're doubling up the resources. So I think that's kind of the threshold, because you need on-site facilities. So generally 50 to 40 does become the lower threshold, but otherwise, so sometimes it does help, like if you have a family, like let's say a family of buildings surrounding, like maybe it's on either side of the street or something like that. There might be a little bit efficiencies in things like that where you could maybe share resources. But if you're looking at just a single project, generally 40 is at least the affordable folks, kind of like that seems to be the lower threshold, because otherwise you kind of are spending the same amount of resources for very less written. And like she said, it's very competitive, and that has to go. It goes down to the per unit cost of a building. So, yeah.
So from the ministry perspective, we're sitting around our table and we're still on our learning journey. I'm pausing here to emphasize this. There is the pathway where you learn first before you jump out, or you learn as you go, right? Which there's some great success stories, but I hear more not, when there is we want to build housing and then we just run right into a developer agreement. I'm encouraging you as a best practice to first, and this is not an expensive process. If you're fortunate enough, you can kind of talk some folks out of a few pro bono hours just to help you get something down, right? Even if it's just begging and pleading, hey, just give us a few hours to let us know if we even have a concept, because you don't want to start spending money on an architect or a financial consultant just to be thousands of dollars out of pocket to learn you don't even have a viable development, right? And so it's important, I believe, for you to educate yourself, because as you're having these conversations, you're already starting to hear how where you started with an original vision may not be what gets built. And so you're going to want to pull this internal team together first. That's going to be your learning body. Hopefully they will stay the journey, but there could be turnover, because you're going to be going back and forth to these two individuals or your own teams to learn a lot about what can we build and how do we pay for it? And then now we're starting to talk about how competitive are we? Because in reality, there's oversubscription on money, meaning there's too many proposed units and not enough dollars. We're also hearing that they're very expensive to build. And therefore, we're one application. And so one thing I want to ask is, how does this stuff happen like within a year or 2 years to get funded?
No. No, I mean, it can take many years to put together the financing. And then there's the design, the design and entitlements piece too, which takes quite a bit of time, plus the financing. And there aren't that many financing rounds for many of these sources. So you might try 1 year and then have to wait a year. Like if you don't get it 1 year, you have to wait a year for the next time. So it can take a long time.
Yeah, and I think that's why also, like, because financing is so tough, we're starting to see a lot of, like, in buildings serving multiple, I guess, population needs, because it's like you're trying to check every boxes, right? And it's also because the funding is competitive. I think trying to check every box. That's also what makes the buildings. You hear of an affordable building, it turns out to be much more expensive than a market rate building, because it's also the best building in the block. So the most sustainable building, it's LEED certified. It's got every bells and whistles that you would actually want on a building, but that's also why it kind of makes it expensive. I have to say, with at least maybe the last 3-4 years, especially with a lot of affordable buildings, we kind of entitling everything through what's called SB 35, which is a streamlined public, so once you submit your drawings, the city has a certain amount of days to kind of review it, and it's also a very fixed review, so somebody cannot just come and say, the building, I don't like this building, there has to be a definite mention in the city's code that why this building cannot be there or something like that. So the entitlement process has become much simpler, and the other thing, Dan, I think you can correct me on it, but it's like once you get the initial round of funding, there's also timelines for it. So from our side, let's say as in what you call is like the initial scoping and the entitlement, right? That's when you get your approvals for a building to be built out there. Then we do what's called construction drawings. Those are the actual drawings that you could take to the site to get built. But for the funding cycles also, there's timelines. Like once you get your approval, you have to, for us, as consultants, we have finished the construction drawings within a certain timeline because you have to hit the next funding cycle. So I think there is a little bit of a streamlined process, forced not, but it's always the first part which takes a little bit longer now. Just trying to get into the funding because it's very competitive. And if you don't make it, then you're waiting for the next cycle. You might have a project what you want, but you just don't have the funding for it.
We have a representative from City of Hayward that's going to talk to us this afternoon about some of the entitlement and things like that. One thing I want to transition to, because we're getting short on time, is as you're doing this work internally, there could also be tension inside the room itself at the church, right? Yeah. And, sometimes the church is worse than the workplace when it comes to working together. But I think it's important that you have alignment. And where am I going with this? I'm going with, you do not want to get in, the church, whoever's running the housing component, you don't want to get in front of the church in and of itself. You really want this to be a shared journey. And as we're learning from where we should be starting a project with, what can we build and how do we pay for it? That's where you start having to have maybe some difficult conversations about who are we going to serve? Because maybe one group wants to serve this population, another group wants to serve this population. One group wants to move faster because of available funding, where another group doesn't want to move as fast. So as you are, and then one thing I also see is folks that are just in the church that are just diehard. We're going to do this no matter what. And I've been in some very happy conversations, and I've seen churches literally split apart. Before my very eyes, I've seen pastors get fired, church members leave, and I've seen churches close over real estate projects gone wrong. And so where am I going with this? I'm going with there are fundamentals that you will learn that are very, there could be some just open roads where this is going to work out fine, but there could be some red flags that emerge early in the process. And it may be information that we just don't really want to hear, but in practical reality, maybe we really need to pay attention. So are there sites, I'm thinking from an architecture perspective, that are just more challenging to build, whether it's be slope or earthquake faults or just not enough area or, you know, landslides? I've seen them all. And I've seen folks who have sites that are just not very feasible, but they're fighting it out. And I just, what are some of the things that you believe make your job easier from an architect? Like characteristics of a site that you think are just easier than others? Not that it's impossible to build, but it's definitely more expensive. But I'm helping folks think about, does our site even have physical characteristics that make sense? And I'm speaking just in general.
Yeah. And I think you touched on a few things, right? Those are kind of big ticket items like, you know, landslide. Since we're in Hayward, the fault line, right? I mean, sometimes that's always kind of like, sometimes it's floodplain and you don't realize, you know, that's certain, especially with churches, like moment you put housing, you can't build housing on a floodplain. You know, you might be able to put commercial uses. But I think generally if you have good access, fire is now a big deal. You know, you need certain requirements, things have changed, and generally if you're over 30 feet. So having great access, the other thing that really helps from a physical standpoint, but also from a programming standpoint is if you have services around it. If it's a well-located site, if you have like transit next to it, you know, it's like, you know, maybe you might be able to decrease your parking requirement, you know, but if you're in a really distant located area, I mean, even if the state allows you to have less parking, you know, people still might need parking. So I think the location and, you know, generally I like rectangular sites, but there's no rectangular sites anywhere, you know, so. Yeah, and I think some of it is like a little bit of like, you know, how large the site is always a little bit of a misnomer because you can always build taller. It might be as in like, if you're looking at senior housing, you're looking at much smaller units, right? So I don't like to kind of say as in like the physical site, I mean, size itself is a constraint. It's kind of, sometimes cities also will allow you to go much more taller in that site, which might not be an issue. But I think as in generally, if it's got good services, it's relatively flat. I mean, that always helps. It helps in your cost of construction, you know. So,
Diana, what about the church? The church has a great flat site with services and great access, and the underlying land is worth $10 million. And they go into an affordable housing program, and they have all this equity. How does that get factored into the financial picture?
You know, it really depends on the circumstances of the project, so that's a little bit hard to give a generic answer to. I mean, what I've often seen when I've worked on projects that were a partnership between a developer and a church is that there may be some development that the church wants as part of the housing development, and there may be kind of the ability to do that development because of the value of the land that the church has. Maybe they're going to do a ground lease and they can get an upfront payment for the ground lease that then they could use to build themselves some parking or a new community center for their purposes. So I think it depends on the goals for the particular project. I will say though, it's good to be mindful that if you are wanting to do that type of church-related development with the affordable housing, that can be a great idea because maybe you have some ground floor space that you want to use, you know, but the housing sources can't be used to finance that. So, you know, you have to get a little creative. I think you were also mentioning that sometimes you can have shared spaces. It gets a little tricky. Attorneys, you know, tax attorneys in the room, you know, might get a little uncomfortable when we talk about shared spaces. But so just be mindful that if you want to do other types of development, the housing funds can't cover that.
So developer fee, what is that? And who gets that?
Yeah, so, for all these affordable development projects, there's expected to be a developer fee included in the budget. Right now, the kind of typical developer fee allowed by the state is $2.5 million. That's, developer fee you can get up front, which pays for, the cost of the time, the staff time to develop it. It also covers the developer's risk because there's a huge amount of risk involved in these development projects. So the developer fee is also there to kind of cover the developer's risk. In terms of how, who gets paid that developer fee, that's something that would be negotiated. Like if you were partnering with a developer, you would need to negotiate that. My sense is maybe the session in the afternoon, you guys might talk some about how to put together kind of agreements with developers. Developer fee would be part of that conversation. It depends on who, the roles and the risks that each entity is taking on.
And so that developer fee is built into the pro forma?
Yes, it's built into the pro forma, and it's also, for example, if you're moving along and you've started construction, your development's going great, and then all of a sudden you realize you have some big cost overrun, that might come out of the developer fee. So it's also this kind of contingency in the budget that's at risk.
So we heard earlier also one of the churches was able to participate in the developer fee, and one didn't even know that was an option. So I remember once, this was probably 6 years ago, a friend of mine knew a church in the Tri-Valley, and they were literally about to sign their commitment to the developer, and they said, "Can you just take a look at this?" And I saw the developer fee, and I called the lady who was running it from the church, and I said, "Hey, are you sharing in this?" She says, "What do you mean am I sharing in this?" I said, "Well, you should be getting some of this money, so call and ask for half." And then she called me back. She said, "They didn't give me half, but they're going to give me $1 million just because I knew to ask for it." And that's a true story. Just because you knew to ask for it. Because if you don't ask, no one's going to just say, "Hey, by the way, you can get half of this money." So as we're in our, I just want to close, and we're going to open it up for questions. What are the things that someone should look for in an architect? So when they're interviewing folks and they're like, I have this architect and this architect and this architect, what are some of the values and attributes, and just, how does someone find an architect that's just right for their development? And also, what should they avoid?
I'll leave the second part out, but but I mean, the values is something, I think you'll have to talk to them, right? It's kind of like, it's very easy to find in the first or two meetings, I think, if you kind of share the same passion about what you want to do or not. And I think it's having connection. But I think what you kind of really need to know is if they've kind of done that work before and how much, and if they've done it actually it really helps if they've got multiple projects, maybe in multiple jurisdictions, maybe with multiple partners, because that means that they're good, right? If they're just doing it in one jurisdiction, it's been just one, partner, that means they've kind of have smoothened that process out, and that's all. The other thing I also find it helpful, especially working with faith-based institutions, is it's a little plug to ourselves, but it's like we also work with churches. Like kind of having a second team who works on the other side of the actual buildings, because a lot of the projects that we're seeing now is using half the parking lot, right? The church is still going to be there, so having to understand what the church needs are a little bit, as a team understanding what the church needs are is actually helpful. And a lot of people don't think about that. They're just thinking, okay, somebody's done affordable housing, and that's what we need, and these guys are really good because it's a synergy. When you build for another project on the same site, both of them have to work together, right? So I think that's very important. Yeah. So,
Diana, how would someone find a financial consultant?
Well, frankly, there aren't very many of us out there. I think there's a lot more architects than there are financial consultants. So there's really only a couple of firms that really do the kind of, I mean, at least that do the specific kind of nonprofit focused. But I mean, I think it's talking to other people who have done projects and say, did you work with them and what'd you think? I think making sure that someone's not over capacity because you want people who are going to be responsive. But really, ask around to others. Yeah.
And then before we question, I'm just going to make one final comment. I think it's important to also make sure that whoever you hire understands churches, right? It's a very patient process. And it's a lot of meetings and then wait, and then meetings and then wait, and then change of minds and wait, and leadership shifts and waiting, right? And if someone isn't understanding of that culture, they may lose patience. It's like these individuals are going to stick with you because they get it. Yesterday you wanted to do senior housing, and then God told you to do veterans housing, so now you're having a fight. And now he has to start all over. But he understands that, right? And we work with folks who understand churches, who have the heart to understand your broader mission. And I just will encourage you, just because they have the competency doesn't mean they automatically have the conscientiousness or the character. There are 3 C's: conscientiousness, character, and competence. A lot of folks hire for competence, but they miss the other pieces. That's especially true for churches. Do we want to open it up for questions?
I have a comment and then a question. So I'm Reverend Sophia DeWitt, and I'm here today with East Bay Housing Organizations. So if you're in the East Bay and you're interested in learning more about the bonds that Diana was referencing earlier, or the voter threshold proposition, come talk to us, because we're leading that work in the East Bay. And right now we're looking for houses of worship that would be interested in endorsing that concept in principle and getting involved more in the campaign, which churches can do because it's an initiative. You're not endorsing a candidate. But my question, I'm also on the small team at my church in Berkeley that's looking at developing affordable housing. And so hear me, I do this every day. I do affordable housing advocacy every day, but I have a very basic question. So as we're looking at development, we've chosen a developer, and the developer, with our input, has chosen an architect. We're in the process of deciding on the development fee and whether it's going to be a ground lease or whether we're going to sell the land that is part of our property, etc. And I hear that we need potentially a land use attorney. So, but I hear today about an owner representative. So can you describe the difference between an owner rep and a land use attorney? And do we need both of you? Do we need one of you? What do we need? Thanks.
So we do have an attorney here for the afternoon panel. I think a land use attorney, from our experience, it's, if you're going for some type of general plan amendment or zoning change and you think it's going to be an uphill battle, a land use attorney may be able to help interpret some of that, but that could be overkill. I think an owner rep can get you there if they understand real estate development. But it's whatever you feel most comfortable. Any other questions? Oh, there's a few.
Thank you all. My name is Stephen Ford. I'm with Lake Merritt United Methodist Church, and we're here at this table. Thank you for talking about the coming to the table with your vision. I know Lake Merritt, we built a new building about 30 years ago, and we're kind of very typical of a lot of aging congregations, people who've been in the city and who chose to stay in the city. Just hearing Bishop Macklin talk about, being here in the community, they were sort of in the community and saw the need right around them. And so that helped them develop their vision. Also, Dr. Agee talked about that. Lake Merritt is like a lot of congregations with aging congregations. We've been there for a long time, and we're in the community. We've been in the community. We know we want to do good, but we're not always necessarily sure which direction to go in. So you talked about it's good to come with a vision, but a lot of older churches do need the help in helping to define that vision. So my question is, are there consultants out there who can help these congregations sort of clarify that vision? And especially getting back to what you said, as through the long haul, going back to having clarified that vision will be very helpful. So what resources are there available for the congregations to help clarify what that vision of work might be going forward?
Yeah, I think what we call that's a discernment process, and it's a very prayerful, patient process. There are a few resources out there that will lead. Megan may know a few. You can talk to her offline, but I'm glad you brought that up, because some ministries just don't know which direction to go, and they may need an outside facilitator to just help them get there. And it's a safe, neutral third party that's the only outcome is the desired and shared vision of the group to get there. And so a discernment consultant, there are a few out there that you may be able to look up that you can bring in and just help you do strategic planning. And that's what the secular world would call it. We have time for one more.
Landis, you can hire DCG for that, and I will shamelessly. I know he doesn't, but it's too important not to say, which is that's what I really like doing. So just to open a brief parentheses, I'm vice president. My background, actually, I was in commercial real estate for many years at JLL, which is one of the largest national brokerage firm, advising foreign capital coming into really complex U.S. deals. And now I do this. And so I'm also coming from the church perspective. DCG does that. There are a few firms like that out there, but we can help you. And it's sometimes good, like Landis said, to have that person who's not the church, who's not the developer, but really speaks both languages and can help you run discernment workshops. And so that's my shameless plug. But we do it, and there are people who have the heart and as Landis said, the skills to do it.
And there are others.
And there are others.
Someone who's someone who sees what your heart is, and they just do good at strategic planning. So they don't necessarily have to be in this space full time, but they understand how to move groups and bring folks together in a collaborative fashion. You might be able to find that in higher ed even. The last question before lunch, because I know everyone wants to eat.
In reflecting on the last question, wouldn't the feasibility study be the first thing to do to help find out what the options are before the discernment starts?
That's a very good question. You can go either way. So what I'll say is it depends on if you're like if we're talking in real estate, centering the real estate as what do we do with this land, then you definitely want to do a feasibility study first, because we encourage that so that folks don't have emotional attachments to a particular outcome that's not feasible. And then now you have a lot of tension that may not be resolved. And so if someone says, we want to do affordable housing, but these two folks said it's really not going to pencil, you don't want to go down this wonderful process of strategic discernment, and you're invested and you're praying and you're all enlightened just to learn that, we can't do that. So it may make sense to have some strategic analysis on your land first, just so you have some brackets that you then can discern. So even if it's housing, for instance, do we want to do affordable housing? Do we want to do teacher housing? Do we want to do workforce housing? Do we want to do market housing or some combination thereof? Those are all viable options for you. And so it may make sense to study the land and then go into your process, because at least you understand your parameters. Before we get started with this panel, Megan's going to talk a little bit about the San Francisco Foundation grant that's available to any of the faith ministries.
So one thing I want to make sure everybody knows about is the Ministry of Housing pre-development feasibility program. And this is provided by DCG Strategies and supported by the San Francisco Foundation with the same grant that's allowing us to put on this program. As you can see, Bill is kindly recording this for us, and we'll edit it, and we'll also have this as a resource on the internet for posterity, so folks can take a look and learn who are not in the room with us here today. But just to return to this program, we have grant funding available for congregations who want to do the feasibility studies that Landis just spoke about in our last session. So these are questions like, what can we legally build here? Are we on a fault line? Do we have to worry about any other sort of environmental things? What really is the high-level framework of what's possible on our site at this time? And many other questions, and it's a program, and it's going to put you in touch with experts. So please do apply. It's on our website, and everything you need to know about it is right here on this brochure. So any questions, come see me, but we would really tell your friends and apply, because it is a really great resource at this early stage. Yes.
How many grants are there per year?
This is our first year, and we haven't defined the number of grants yet, but we're still figuring that out. But it's apply and then Landis?
Yeah, and they're one-time funds. So when the pool is gone, then if they renew, we'll find out. But right now, it's just one time, and it's intended to get through some of those early conversations and to learn. And the San Francisco Foundation thought it was prudent to provide these resources to ministries in particular who need a lot of help with this real estate development journey. So the conversation that we just had was about the exploration of feasibility at a very high level. Although you will keep the architect and the financial consultant as part of your permanent team going forward, they are going to help you understand, is there a there, right? And so we kind of talked about some of those values and principles about, is there a there? So this panel is when it's time to start actually spending money. And this is when it gets real, right? So we've already decided we have a site that's feasible. We understand that the site should be competitive for funding. And then what do? So we have a design that we like, and we understand what the financial modeling looks like. So we're satisfied in that regard. Internally as a ministry, we are aligned and we're happy. And now we're ready to take the next step in our journey because we've now made a decision that we're ready to commit to development. Now, even though we spent an hour talking, that could be 6 months. It could be a year to get to that point. Even internally, there was a question earlier about just the internal discernment work. That could take however long it takes. I always encourage churches to take their time and just make sure that there's alignment, and then engage folks once you have alignment, and then do your feasibility, and then are we ready to now make a commitment? And the reason we recommend you do it in that way is because now you're really empowered to marry a developer, because that's in essence what you're going to be doing. I mean, you really are going to be in a bona fide relationship legally. And once you're in the relationship, then it's very difficult to extricate yourself. And we have an attorney up here that's going to help you understand what that looks like. But we like the church to pick the developer, not the developer to pick the church, which is typically what's happening. Most of the developers, affordable housing in particular, also, they have land acquisition folks. Their job is to bring opportunities into the door. And so they're typically very familiar with where the land is in their city, who's operating it. Maybe they're having preliminary conversations already. But it's usually a situation where we find if you don't already understand for yourself, have that primary knowledge, then you're going to be dictated to throughout that entire process, and you're going to be at the table with an inferior position because you really don't know the numbers. You really don't know what the design looks like, and you're going to be trusting the developer to tell you those things. Hopefully you pick a developer that's honest with integrity and they'll tell you the truth, but there are just some things that just may not come out, like the developer fee, for instance. So we like you to be in a position to already know how many sites, give or take, your site can handle, what type of programming is most likely viable at your site. Because now the journey becomes, who's a good culture fit for us, right? In the Bay Area, we are rich with some very competent, affordable housing developers. I know Saha was or is still here. Eden Housing is represented here. We know there's Mercy and Bridge and the Baltsy. I'm not picking out any in particular because I know a lot of them do amazing work. And there are different cultural nuances, different geographical expertise that will drive your decision-making process. We always like to say, just make sure they're a good culture fit for your church, make sure they understand your local geography. It's a plus if they have the political relationships and some track record locally as well. But as you go through that journey, now you're kind of at least armed with being able to ask questions like, well, what do you do with the developer fee? That's a really big litmus test for you, because if they say, oh, that's negotiable, to me, that's further conversation. If they say that's off limits, you may not want to continue your conversation. And there are some developers who will not share the developer fee or will give just very little of it. So our panel this afternoon is, now we're moving into our commitments. So we have Louis Liss from Eden Housing. We have Sarah Bowser, seat of Hayward. And we have Diane Jackson from Goldfarb and Lippman, who pretty much everyone uses. So she's a very good resource. And what we're going to talk about is, how do you get into these commitments? What is their side of the equation? Best practices, and also kind of how do they look for partners? Sarah's going to talk a little bit about the entitlement process. You know, it's probably one of the most mysterious, unknown variables in real estate development for folks who have no idea how to go through that process. It can be very intimidating. And then we have Diane, who's here to protect you, who literally is here to protect you. So I'll let each of you introduce yourself and talk a little bit briefly about just what you do. And we can just go this way.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm Louis Liss. I'm an Associate Director of Real Estate Development at Eden Housing. I'm one of these people Landis described on the acquisitions team. And I like to think of myself as a straight shooter.
Good afternoon. I'm Sarah Bowser. I'm the Development Services Director for the City of Hayward. The Development Services Department is where you'd come to get your entitlement, this elusive entitlement. We are the Planning and Building Department, as well as Housing, that is part of our team here at Hayward. Makeup might be different at your respective cities where your land and your properties might be, but those are the folks that you're going to want to talk to at the city, is talking to the folks in the planning and the building and then the housing department. But again, we're here to partner with you all, so I don't want it to be scary, and hopefully we can make it feel a little less scary before you leave here.
My name is Diane Jackson McLean. I'm with the law firm of Goldfarb and Lippman, and we do affordable housing with nonprofit housing developers, as well as representing public agencies like the City of Hayward. In terms of providing financing. Our firm have approximately 35 attorneys. We do developments all over the state of California. I have been involved in some faith-based developments, and really just kind of explaining the process to the faith-based entity to really empower them with the power that they do have, because most of the time they own the land. And that really is a lot of power that they should not just give away. So it's kind of like walking through the process and really basically having an understanding of the whole process of the pre-development, the construction, and the permanent. And one thing I always try to communicate, it is not a quick process. It really requires a lot of patience and understanding, but it is definitely something that is doable.
Okay, so from a logistics perspective, as you're planning for housing, you know, even though you will start having these early conversations, hopefully with an owner's rep or someone who can fill that capacity for you, an architect to help you just understand early design options, the financial consultant that starts to put that financial picture together. Communication and over communicating is a good value to have. You just constantly want to be communicating and making sure the folks on your team are pretty organized and good communicators. Why that's important is because unlike the first panel where you have them in early, they're helping you flush out your concepts. They should stay on your team permanently, but they may not be the particular individuals that are fulfilling that same capacity on the other side of your binding commitments. Why am I making a nuance? Is because if you hire or if you partner with a developer, let's just take Lewis here. You like Lewis, you believe that their culture of their company fits you or their nonprofit corporation fits you, they have the requisite experience. So for instance, they started in Hayward, but they're now all over the state. They have a tremendous CEO, and they're very visionary, as is Saha, as is Mercy, as is Bridge, right? So they all kind of have their own great attributes, but there's going to be one that just stands out above all the others for you personally. And they may have a different architectural relationship. They may have a different financial consultant. And those are really the relationships that are going to carry the day. So even though you're engaging up front with some folks, you may just be very transparent that, this is a fact finding, we're learning. Do you work with any developers? And interview them also. Like, what housing developers do you like to work with? What attorneys do you work with, et cetera, et cetera. Just so that when you get to this stage, hopefully you have a team that there's continuity across, but you may need to be prepared to switch as you enter into these binding relationships. So I just wanted to take that. So Lewis, let's start with you. So we know now what we want. And so now we're picking up the phone and calling folks like Lewis and we're interviewing them. Or we maybe put out a letter of interest or an RFP, but there's a lot of meat to it. Because what Lewis really does want, and I'm just kind of, projecting, is Lewis wants a project that he can build. And ideally, the more clarity you have, the easier it is for him to be a straight shooter with you because it takes some of the risk out. Because there's a lot of risk in development. And Sarah's the one who creates all that risk. So.
Not true.
No. So why don't you share with us kind of just your process, and as you're doing land acquisition, what are you looking for, and what are some of the things churches should be thinking about as they talk to folks like yourself?
Sure. Well, first I'll say if your team included Diana from earlier, we would always keep her. She's my favorite. So that's just a heads up. So I think what we look for in an acquisition is first and foremost, is Eden going to be able to build it? And we're looking at the reality of what the current and kind of projected future resources are. I'm sure you've heard at various points today, it's a little glum right now. So we're looking for partners who have reasonable expectations around timing. We're looking for kind of a reasonable expectation around the site plan. So something where, there's a real commitment to making sure the housing project can stand on its own and move forward. And then also, I think we're always looking for a partner who has a clear decision-making structure and is able to bring forward somebody who represents their interests and can work with us and negotiate and partner on the project.
And so let's just say you hire someone like Eden or Saha. Then it's like, well, how do I show up in that relationship? And I'm just going to use tax credits as an example because it's so complex. And we heard Father Phil earlier talk about they didn't have an LLC, so that changed how they could show up. So before you actually sign something that Eden puts in front of you, you're going to talk to somebody like Diane. Because she's going to then say, here is what I recommend that not only keeps you in legal good standing and mitigates your risk, but this is just how you can show up structurally. So maybe you can talk about how do they go into a relationship with Eden from a legal perspective, and then what are the different entities that are necessary? Because we had a conversation, I know Tim and I were on a conversation with CHDC, we do a lot of work with them, and we were explaining to the pastor, and I know it's a church that she works with, that the importance of having a 501(c) that's different than the church's 501(c). So we were recommending some bifurcation, not only for liability, just but for flexibility. So maybe you can just share a little bit about legally what's needed?
So I think initially, once you have selected a developer, I think there needs to be a discussion in terms of what are those key areas that you want to have input on, that you matter in terms of the structure, the design, how you want to show up, where you want to be consulted. You may not make the decision, but you want to be consulted on certain key things. And generally that is started with what is called a memorandum of understanding. And that memorandum of understanding is the initial document before you form the legal entities to really have a blueprint of the relationship between the church and the developer. And generally we do recommend creating an affiliate of the church rather than the church itself. Because the church, usually the purpose of the church is not, sometimes it's affordable housing, but most times it's not. And also there can be some issues with the separation of church and state. So we always recommend to have an affiliate entity form with a 501c3 ultimately, and so that entity is actually controlled by the church or the board of trustees or whoever has been delegated that authority. And so that is actually the initial document is the MOU. The MOU will actually deal with such things as the developer fee, in terms of this is when you really see if you got a partner or not, because it is tell you if I'm going to get 100% or I'm going to get 60%, I'm going to get 40%. I think it is a really, I represent CHDC quite a bit, and they are really good in terms of, providing development of capacity to the church, so that eventually the church will actually understand what's going on in the development process. They're not just a entity that on name only, but really understanding what that is. And so so that the experienced developer is having the church affiliate develop capacity to really understand the process. So that's kind of a long story, but that's the first process. And then eventually, depending on the type of financing that is for the project, for low-income tax credits, you normally do have to have, you have to have what is called a limited partnership. And in the limited partnership, there are two entities. There's basically the general partner, which is going to be the nonprofit or the limited liability company, and you have the tax credit investor, who's going to be the limited partner. It is the general partner, which is generally an affiliate. Many times it can be affiliate of both the church and the developer, or it can be a two-person LLC. The issue is that the nonprofits don't need a tax benefit because they're tax exempt, but they are able to take advantage of getting the property tax in the state of California as long as they are a 501c3, and that's why it's important that the general partner in a limited partnership be a 501c3. And the tax investor, I'm not going to go into all the details because it is complex, but the tax investor comes in to take advantage of the tax credits. So in connection with explaining that structure, the attorney really does, I do take time to kind of explain what that process is and what it entails, because the project itself, it moves kind of quickly, but that initial formation of the legal entity is important. We usually have to have, meetings. Your board of directors have to actually adopt resolutions given the authority. Most of the time when you have banks or lenders involved, if even the city and a title company, they want to see that you have authority to borrow all this money, even if you're getting some money from the city or the Bank of America or whoever you're getting the money from, that you have the authority, and also that you have the authority to actually form the entities that you're engaging in. And as Lewis was saying, was saying it's so important that churches, once you have decided your mission, that you have a core people who can make decisions. You have to either delegate that or have a structure, because these projects, when you look at the financial performance, I think that Diana was talking about earlier, they're really tight. And so you don't want to go down a path and all of a sudden the church can't make a decision, because time is money. So you really do want to have a situation where you have delegated that, you have had that kind of brainstorming session to have someone on the church's side that can make decisions, and you want to be able to stick with that because that really helps the development team to move forward.
I'm going to ask a leading question for Sarah. So let's just say they've selected their developer, they have their MOU. Should they then just immediately apply for housing permits? Or when should they talk to you?
Ideally, we want to talk to you as early as possible, but obviously maybe not as early as some of the earlier conversations we were having. You're going to want to understand the feasibility, and so yes, I think you would want to wait, but until you've sort of figured that out and understanding whether this is something you definitely want to do on your properties, but you want to come and you want to talk to us. You don't necessarily, at least in our city, and this opportunity or this process probably exists in lots of other jurisdictions as well, but we have a very free process. It doesn't cost anything to go through it, but we have what's called a conceptual development review process. And this is an opportunity for you to submit your vision, your plan, your layout, showing the boundaries of the property and where you're looking to place that housing. You submit that to the jurisdiction, and we have a process by which we route those plans, your ideas, your concepts, to all of the different departments that would have an opportunity to review it. They look at it and they can provide you feedback. This location isn't going to work. You're going to need X number of utilities, and this is going to be complicated. Or this is too tall. You're going to need 3 exit ways to get out of it in order to comply with fire code. You're going to need to do X, Y, and Z to sort of adjust your plan to comply with design standards or whatever might be adopted in that respective jurisdiction. And so what's great is it provides you that early idea or that early feedback so that you kind of know what you're getting into as you're going through that entitlement process, as you're going through and getting your planning approval or getting your building permits. It gives you a whole list of things that you'll share with your architect and the other professionals that are part of your development team that are going to be those experts to help guide you through that. But it helps provide you that early feedback so that you know what you're in for as far as other fees or other costs that might come up as you're going through that process. And so that is free, but it still takes time. So I would also reiterate the need to remain patient through that process, but keep that line of communication with the city and with your design team so that we're all on the same page moving forward. I think that one thing that I do want to mention is that all jurisdictions are required to develop a certain number of housing units, and it's called our regional housing needs allocation. And so we are partners. We have a need to have housing produced, and you may be looking to have housing built on your site. And so there is some synergy in that partnership, and we do want to work with you to find the best way to sort of realize that development so that we're all sort of winning in that situation.
Louis, why is that early feedback important?
Well, when we're looking at a project and thinking about how long it's going to take to deliver, a big component of that, I would say there's 2 basic parts. Part 1 is getting it entitled, approved for planning and zoning purposes, and part 2 is getting financed. And they work together. You don't want to get something approved that you're not going to be able to get financed. But both of those processes are big what ifs. We don't know how long it's going to take, and they're both costly. You have to pay attorneys, architects, consultants to structure your deal and put together all the drawings. And if it takes 8 years to get entitled, then you've burned a lot of interest, like a lot. If you're paying taxes or any kind of other holding costs, which is sort of the nice thing about a partnership with a faith-based organization, is they usually don't have big holding costs. That can be expensive too. So I would say definitely having a good architect, and if you do go the route of an owner's rep who knows kind of what they're doing in terms of how the land use might play out. So we think that this could be approved through this process and shouldn't be so bad. Having that kind of framework in mind and then going to the city to propose it in sort of a conceptual safe space can really be a great thing to communicate to a developer. Hey, we massed a 5-story building and this site is in the housing element already as affordable housing, and we talked to the city and they liked it. We just got to figure out the fire truck. So do you want to work together on this? And then we'd say, it's in the housing element? That's great. Yeah, very low risk. Let's go for it.
The entitlement process, we've been hearing that word float around. Lewis, are you spending money right now on entitlements during this process? And
If I'm
how
breathing,
much?
I'm spending money on entitlement.
Can you give an order of magnitude of kind
No.
of what you might put at risk
$1 million?
before your approvals?
Yes. Up to. Sometimes more, sometimes less. It depends on the approvals and it depends on the city. Some cities really want to rubber stamp affordable housing because they're legally required to. And if you're one of those cities, I think Hayward, hopefully, I wouldn't say rubber stamp, that puts you in a bad position, but really want to say yes. So if you're one of those cities, pat yourself on the back. But others will give you 10 ways to say no. And sometimes it's about the fire trucks and you have to say, okay, we'll fix it because you really don't want the building to burn down. But other times they'll make things up. And it gets really expensive to redesign over and over and over again with a moving goalpost. So there is some risk inherent, even with all the great state laws that are recently passed that have changed the landscape.
So Sarah, how about the community and the neighbors? How does that play out into this process?
Thankfully, I hope that's going to get easier because of some of the changes in state law that are really requiring projects that comply with development standards, and it is housing because we are in a housing crisis, that there's really limited opportunities to sort of deny these types of projects, which I think is a huge win all around. However, that doesn't mean that the community that surrounds the projects aren't going to have concerns and aren't going to express them and aren't going to be something that you're going to have to deal with. So we always encourage, regardless of what type of project, whether we're talking about, a commercial development or housing development or whatever it might be, reach out to your community, reach out to the neighborhood, talk to them about what you're looking and proposing to do, get an understanding of what their concerns are, so that you can try to proactively address them either in the way that it's designed or just in developing a partnership and helping them understand. Sometimes it's just the fear of the unknown because they don't know what you're proposing to do and they have a different vision in their head of what you are proposing to do, which is probably 180 degrees different from what you actually are looking to do on your property. So it's really important to reach out to them. Now, through processes, there might be requirements for notification. So your neighbors may get notified once an application is submitted. So they're going to learn about it that way. So I think that they would be much happier learning about it from the project proponent than they would getting some postcard in the mail that says, oh, so-and-so is doing some development on their lot. So I think it's important to reach out to them. You may not be able to please everybody, but I will say the good news is, as I said, because of all of these changes in state law, we'll listen to them, we'll hear them, and if there's an opportunity to make the project better and address the concerns, I'm sure everybody here would be willing to do that. But in the end, if the project complies with requirements, you're going to get your approvals.
So I wanted to ask a question that's a little bit off track to what we're talking about, but I think is pertinent. Diane, so when the tax credit syndication period is starting to, we're getting on that 15-year horizon, I've heard, and I mentioned earlier, that I know of churches sometimes can't buy their properties back. How does the church protect itself? So for right now, the church owns the land free and clear. They have this vision for ministry. They develop this housing. They partner with Lewis. And after 15 years, they no longer own anything and they're not in control. How do they protect themselves against being kicked out of the development later?
Okay, I'm not a tax attorney for once. That's my partner. But, the whole structure is, the tax credit structure is such that the investor stays in until they no longer are eligible to get tax credits and they're out. And so one of the ways that the faith-based organization can protect itself is, one, to, at the end of the tax credit compliance period, they have an option to purchase the property back. And generally, they purchase it at a purchase price that's equal to the debt on the property. And you kind of outline that. You negotiate that up front that's one of the closing documents, which would be recorded, that actually have that kind of option to purchase. And if the church is not in a position to purchase it, then usually another nonprofit will be in a position to purchase. So that is basically the way that they ensure that they will be in control. So I think it's important, and generally it's not the church, it's the affiliate organization that's been created so that the project will go back to that entity. And so that's basically the way it's done. Normally what happens is after, and you know, I've been doing this for a while, and I've seen where after the 15-year period, basically the project gets refinanced and another tax credit investor comes in and it starts all over again. So so the project continues. And the reason why that's important is because it ensured that those units remain affordable. That's the issue. Because most of the individuals who are in those units are paying no more than 30% of their income. And so you do have to have an infusion of funds as well as operating subsidy in order to continue to ensure that those units remain affordable. So it is really a good thing that it gets refinanced at the end of the period. But it is really kind of negotiating and making sure that at the beginning, when the construction closing occur, that you do have a document that specifically, and this is where we kind of bring in our tax partner to negotiate it with the investor attorney to make sure that we are in a position to ensure that the nonprofits or the church affiliate has the opportunity to purchase the property at the end of the tax compliance period. Yeah.
So Louis, sticking with that, so you partner with a church and they are telling you up front, we want to stay in with Eden post 15 years. So when you go out to renew, we want to keep this relationship intact. So how do they have that conversation with you so that you understand expectations?
Well, this is often the most emotional component of the whole process, is that it's a church that's on their land for a very long time and the congregation has ties to it, and the process can feel like selling out to a developer. So there's often a very high emotional value to retaining some kind of control or involvement. And then, of course, there is, protecting against somebody else running away with the upside risk. So this happens very early and often. What I will say is we negotiate the options all the time. The one thing is that there's sort of two parts of it. One is us against the investor, and then the other one is us working it out together. So usually the way it works is you come up with the protection to make sure that above all else stays affordable, stays nonprofit, and the investor goes away and doesn't screw us. And then we work out together, do you want to own it first? And then does it go to us together and Eden alone, or which way? So that's an option. Two things to know is that buying the whole thing is not the only way to stay in the deal. Some churches want to do ground leases of their land, and that's often a feasible way to do things and stay involved for, whatever short of perpetuity is allowed. And then the other thing to keep in mind is if you are going to be planning to purchase the whole development at the end of year 15, you have to have the capacity to operate it. And this is actually something we've done with some of our partners, including CHGC, who have wanted to be ready to buy at the end of the deal. So it meant kind of putting together an asset management function, like getting ready with the relationship with the management company that was going to work, learning how to own a tax credit development. So if it's something you want, it's something that we've worked on before.
Sarah, how long does the entitlement process typically take? And I know that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but we've heard that Louis can spend up to $1 million upwards or close to it. And there's a lot of competition for the money. So kind of how long is this process and what's happening? And then who is the planning commission and what role does council have and all that stuff?
That's a lot. Okay. So I will say that the process does vary, and the process timeline has probably been significantly reduced because of a lot of the changes in state law, which is amazing. To be honest, we don't want to be taking you through a lengthy entitlement process either, especially not to build something that I think we all know is needed. I think that it really kind of depends on what you're doing and what's involved in the project. But if we're talking about 100% affordable housing that's being built on your faith-based property, the planning element or the planning part of that process doesn't take long at all. We're reviewing your application when it comes in. We're comparing it against our objective design standards. So these are design criteria that anybody can look at and fully understand what it means, right? These are not obscure standards like fit in with the quality and the community character. They have to be clearly defined, define distances from property lines, design criteria. What do the windows look like? What percentage of glaze is required on certain frontages of buildings? Really clear standards. If your project complies with those standards, you're approved. That's it. The planning part of the process is done. And then you're moving into the construction drawings. So, the money really comes in, where the money is coming into play is the preparation of those drawings and the cost of paying the architect and the designers to draw those plans up and the engineers to evaluate the utilities associated with the project and any grading work that might be needed on the property. And then you're submitting for building permits. And that process involves you submitting the plans, going through that process. There's some initial upfront costs that typically need to be paid to the building department to complete their review of the plans. That goes through and can go through any number of rounds of review. It really kind of depends on how well the plans are designed, how clear they're representing what it is that you're looking to do. Once those plans meet the black and white of the building code, and if it complies with that, you're issued a building permit. That process could still take 6 months, 8 months, really kind of depends on the quality of the plans, how many times you have to change things, and how much back and forth there might be to sort of address and meet code requirements. But then once you have your building permit, that's in hand and you're ready to start construction. And so then that's really on a totally different timeline and will vary from city to city depending on how quickly you're able to build and call in for your inspections and have that be inspected. And there's a number of processes. But if your project involves a lot more, maybe the zoning isn't in place correct, or the general plan land use designation isn't correct, and maybe there's a much lengthier entitlement process. Thankfully, a lot of that is gone by the wayside, thank you to the state, making it far easier. But I think some of the stories we heard early at the very first panel and the length of time that it took them to go through the process, they didn't have the benefit of some of these changes in state law, which really lengthened that processing time. So that's the good news, but it doesn't make it less scary or complicated, and it certainly may feel like it's taking forever and a day, but I promise it is pretty fast. And so, but it still could take 6, 8 months to a year maybe to get through that full process and have your permits in hand to begin construction.
So I have a legal question, and I know some of it's internal church politics, some of it's interpersonal relationships, but I had two different churches that one church, they were going down feasibility and they got to the point where it was time for formation of their entities, and the pastor had put everything in the pastor's name. Another time, there's another church, and I know she may know some of these folks, so I'm very careful not to blast anyone out, but the nonprofit ran away with the property that the church started, right? They formed a nonprofit and they went rogue and they disaffiliated from the church. How do churches protect themselves? There's so much trust in the process and everybody's smiling up front. Everything feels good up front. Then real dollars start passing.
So, I think this is important at the beginning of this process. When you are forming that new entity that's going to be the affiliate of the church, you need to make sure who is going to be the board of directors. And not just who's going to be there when the first ones, but what is the criteria for when there's a vacancy? Because what we have seen is that many times a church would have formed a legal entity and they have bylaws with the board of directors, And the board of directors are just the people who have been church members on that day. But it doesn't say that in the replacement of the board of directors have to be the majority of the board of directors who vote them in. That kind of criteria does not ensure that those individuals are church members or that they have any connection with the church. And that is what happened. And that's how your church can just, your project can just walk away from you. So it's important very, early on when you are developing or creating that entity, we kind of recommend that the church has the majority board somehow. One of the criteria could be that the majority of the board have to be on the board of trustees of the church. That could be a criteria. I had one situation where the minister was an integral part of the development. He or she was going to be around forever, or somebody in that place was going to be around, not that individual. So one of the criteria was that one of the board members had to be the minister of the church or whoever is in charge of the church. So that's why you ensure that there is, that kind of control. We also have, other criteria. You may want to make sure that there's someone who has some kind of connection to the community, and that could be a criteria. But it is important to look at your bylaws very carefully. So when you hire an attorney to prepare your articles and bylaws, one of the things that I have said is like, sometimes you'll get a member of the church who's like, well, this person, they're an attorney, they can write it up. No, you need to get someone who actually know about bylaws, because the legal field has so many different specialties. And just because you have that bar license does not mean that you understand the requirements of bylaws and articles. So really get someone who has the experience and can explain to you, what you are creating and how you can ensure that you are going to maintain control. And, sometimes we do have to have this delicate conversation with the pastor or whoever is the person in charge, because, they may be in charge of the church, but you don't want a one-person show for your entity. And so I think really having that conversation in terms of that the corporation is doing what's in the best interest of the corporation. But at the same time, you can ensure that the minister is always on the board. So you're not, eliminating his or her influence, but you really are indicating that, because this is affordable housing, most of the time it can't happen without public funds. So it's bigger than just the church. It is basically public funds that are providing what Sarah was saying, something that's very much needed in the community. And being able to explain that. I have gone to prayer meetings and explained over and over again, really to be able to, so that the church members and the minister really understand the mission of affordable housing and what we're doing. And that really kind of addressed some of the issues so you don't run into the problems, I think, that Lyndon. But it does take that, having that kind of cultural education. Your professionals need to have the cultural education to really go to the church and explain the process.
I'm going to ask you a question, Sarah. I know it's another projection, but is the city staff, maybe we could just say Hayward because you're in Hayward, but sometimes cities get a bad rep, right? And folks see the city as the enemy and all these requirements and conditions of approval, but I know there in times gone past is why we have a lot of new legislation. There were anti-housing cities, and they made it very difficult for projects to get built in their cities. But for the most part, these are civil servants, right? That are they really here to help, or are they just like the DMV?
No. What I will say is it probably varies from city to city, to be frankly honest, but I can speak to my own experience and what it's like in Hayward. And in Hayward, you are going to have friendly faces that are there to help you. We want to partner with you. We are available to answer your questions, to meet with you, to have those early conversations, to talk through what you're proposing to do, and provide you some options. I instill in all of my staff the importance of being creative, really looking at what does our code say, and is there any flexibility in there? Is there some gray? Can we partner with you? Can we look at some other options? Can we come up with some solutions? And working across departments to say, okay, I know that this is what it says, but I think that there might be some flexibility here. Can we look at what options there might be? Can we find solutions to help get a project over a challenge that they might be experiencing? So I can at least speak to your experience. If you are in Hayward and you're going to look to do this in Hayward, you are going to have friendly faces at the city. Our council is very much supportive of housing and the development of affordable housing and just housing in general. The housing division that is part of my department is very much about doing work to try to support the development of affordable housing and the preservation of housing. And I think that you will find friendly faces, at least in Hayward. I have a lot of colleagues and friends that work at other cities, and I guarantee you're going to find friendly faces in your respective cities as well. It can be scary, but we're not, and I promise we are here. We do want to answer your questions. We want to provide you the clear direction. We want the process to go as smoothly as possible for all of you with these projects, and we'd like to see the housing get developed. We've taken a lot of steps to really look at our process and try to streamline it as much as possible to ensure that we're getting the development of housing and affordable housing in our city. But there is a lot of support all the way up from staff all the way to our elected officials, at least in Hayward, to see affordable housing developed in our city.
And I know I asked that question somewhat facetious, but I just wanted you to recognize that you're really empowered to work with city staff. And I know all city staffs aren't created equal. Sometimes it's hard to get, I'm not speaking of Hayward, but there are some jurisdictions that it's just tough to get anyone live. They don't return your calls. They're not helpful, but you have to kind of stay the course and be as aggressive as you need to be to get the city to give you what you need for your development. And if you want feedback, get your feedback. And if you have to go to the city manager, if you talk to a council person, do what you have to do. And I'm saying don't let anyone turn you away at the door if they're being a little difficult. You just may have an employee that everyone knows, oh, while they're at the counter today, it's going to be a bad day for people. But don't give up on that. So and we're going to open it up for questions. But before we go there, I just wanted to, Lewis, so when you have this development and you know it can get built, and Diane has done everything to prepare all the legal work, so now there's a relationship. The building gets built, and how are those projects governed? And what is the role for the church during operations? I've heard things about there's like a board that governs the property, and can you just explain a little bit about what happens after you're done with construction?
Yeah, that's a good question. And first, I just wanted to add, in terms of the cities, they have a super hard job. It is impossible to build in California. We have the most aggressive building code in the country. The environmental regulations are really aggressive and intense and difficult to meet. And we have a populace that is litigious and passionate. It's easy to be a developer, but it's hard to be, in City Hall being run at with pitchforks. So in terms of operation of the property, there are definitely a few ways to go. You can set up a board for a specific property, or you can just, set up in the partnership agreement, here's who's going to manage it, and here's how we would make a decision to change who manages it. So you can either have a board, or you can not have a board and just have a process for making decisions.
And before we open, last question, and I'm going to ask it to Diane. So let's just say everything was great in the beginning with the developer, and it just goes south. The relationship just deteriorates. The developer goes rogue. How does the church get out of that? Or can they? Or what are the things that they should do to protect themselves, if anything could be done, if they need to pivot to a different relationship?
Well, basically, the documents itself, generally what's going to happen is you're going to have a limited partnership agreement. And in that agreement, it's going to say, the conditions under which one can be removed or withdraw, and so that's really the way that it is. You deal with it. Most of the time, so I have seen where the parties will have a discussion and they would negotiate. If the relationship has gone south, most of the time the parties don't want to continue. So they will come up with a way for the parties to exit, but also it has to be done in such a way that the project is not adversely affected, because you have the tax credit investor who will come after you if you do something that's going to, affect their tax credits. You have the city has probably provided some money. You probably have the state that's provided money. So your lenders and your investor would probably have to agree before someone to exit, because they want to make sure that particularly if the experienced developer is leaving, they want to make sure that either you have someone else coming in that's going to take their place, or that you have the capacity to ensure that that project is going to, still go on and is not going to be adversely affected by that exit. So I think that it's important early on, and I think it was Landis was saying, to really interview your developer, because many times the success of these projects depend on trusting of the partner that you have selected. And so, as attorneys, we can draft just about anything, but you can't draft trust. You can't. So I think, really being to have that trust at the beginning is going to save you a lot of headaches later on. So
Thank you. We'll open up for questions. I'm hoping there are questions, because this is a great group to ask.
So I'll direct this to Sarah since you mentioned it. But, kind of what's your definition of neighborhood? I mean, right? Because we use these words, but what does that really mean in terms of the kind of buy-in you need to get from the neighborhood?
So that's a good question, and it probably depends on the reach, right, of the project and the extent of what you're actually proposing to do. But from a legal perspective, when we're doing notifications of projects, we're notifying property owners and residents that live within a 300-foot radius of the subject site. So, I mean, from a legal perspective, that's who we're legally bound to sort of notify about projects that are coming into a city. But you might look at what 300 feet is and say, well, that's only half of this block on this street, and we really want to go all the way to the end of that street and really make sure we're talking to everybody in that neighborhood. But that's about what we're looking at. But your neighborhood might be greater depending on the neighborhood that your organization is serving. And so you might want to go farther than that. And I would say that it doesn't, just because that's what we're legally bound to do, doesn't mean that you might not want to utilize membership within your faith-based organization to have a deeper reach and to reach out into other areas, because you might have members that attend your congregation that live on the opposite side of town. And so you're going to want to, use all of the resources. But when we're talking about sort of neighborhood, that's sort of the immediate, probably 2 to 3, maybe 4 blocks around the area of where the property is going to be developed. Yes. That is going to property owners and residents that live or own property within 300 feet of the subject property.
Okay, and you will still do that even if it's an SB4 application?
No, that is not a requirement. So they wouldn't receive any sort of notification through that under SB4. It's a ministerial process. You're developing housing. There is no discretionary review. There's no subject to CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, sort of the obnoxious environmental regulations that Lewis mentioned that we're all subject to in the state of California. A lot of that is streamlined, and that's been that's the value or the benefit of some of this state legislation. We're really looking at your project and comparing it with our objective design standards. Does it meet it? Great, it's approved. There is no process. It's considered ministerial. We have no discretion to say yay or nay. It's essentially, it meets the standards, you get approval, it's done. And then there isn't a required notification as you're going through a building permit process. So I think that's where, if you are utilizing some of that state legislation to develop your project or develop the housing projects, it's important, as Landis had mentioned, to do that proactive outreach, because there isn't going to be a notification requirement through a city process. So, what you'll see happen is you're going to move through the process, you're going to have your building permit, you're going to go out, you're going to start breaking ground, and the city's going to get a bunch of calls. What's going on at the corner of X Street and Y Street? We're going to say, well, that's housing, and it's been approved and it's allowed, and there's nothing they can do. But if you've done that outreach, we're not getting the calls, you're not getting the calls, and you're not having to field this after the fact. You've brought them into the fold of the conversation to be part of the process and part of that development. Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for engaging in this panel. I had another SB4 related question, which was about the rezoning process. I know that the law kind of prescribes the different amounts of density depending on the various areas that you're in. But I was wondering if you could speak to, again, from the planning perspective, what that process is like, what the timeline is like that folks can usually expect. Yeah, thank you.
I don't know that we've had any applications come in taking advantage of SB4 yet. It's just been adopted or signed into law. So I think that we'll see. But my guess is you're looking at a matter of like 2 weeks, maybe like it tops on a planning review, where we'd just be taking it in and comparing it against the standards and saying, yeah, this looks great. Go ahead and develop your construction drawings and submit for a building permit. So the process is quick. I don't even think we have a fee associated with it. So, I mean, it's really, we're just evaluating your project and comparing it against our development standards. So that part of it is really simple. But if you're looking at doing, more market rate housing and something that doesn't meet sort of the standards of either an SB 35 or an SB 4, then, all bets are off, and there might be a totally different entitlement process or a different, set of planning application review that may take several months to go through. But if you're taking advantage of SB4, it's nothing.
I just wanted to add that, to take that SB4 will be quick, but that as soon as you have what Lewis was saying, you already have your financing together, which generally has been in the work for a couple of years before that. So I think you have to really recognize that there are two processes that are happening concurrently. One is the entitlement process, and the other one is the financing. And the financing, you need quite a bit of lead time as well. So if you have a project that you have your finances together, then yes, it's going to be quick. But if you don't have your financing, SB4 is not going to help you because you have to have money to construct. Yeah.
What about if your property shares a border with another city? So we're in one city and we share a border with another city, and at that border is shared with a community college. So then we go to our city planning department, but does the other city and does the community college have any say or input or need to have input into what we're doing with our property?
Not sure I fully understand.
Is it owned by, is the property in one city and it's adjacent, or is it crossing borders?
It's it's in one city, and we are allowing the college that's in the other city to share some of our property. So our property line goes onto the college's border, or over the college's border.
But where you would do the project is solely within one jurisdiction.
We'd probably like to take our project all the way to our project line, which is sitting on the community college campus.
That is in a different city.
Yes.
Yeah, then it gets a little more complicated, and you're going to need to partner and be working together with all of the entities, and starting those conversations early, because I don't know what the respective processes would be in that scenario, but there's going to be interest and influence, and it's important to sort of maintain those partnerships and those relationships, because there could be a dual process. Doesn't mean that it has to happen concurrently or consecutively, but there will be some coordination that will be needed in that instance. Yeah, I don't know specifically.
It does say higher education, so I think it does, yeah.
Not for,
I would just add the part of the scenario that actually gives me the most anxiety is that you have an agreement already with another institution to share your property and have certain uses that are going back and forth. So are there like easements or agreements recorded that need to be resolved? And then also, like, practically speaking, are you going to be able to come up with a project or renegotiate your agreement in such a way that both the housing project and this coexistence can move forward? Or maybe you have to find a way to terminate whatever kind of sharing, and is that feasible?
Sound like there needs to have some preliminary discussions with the other jurisdiction before you start.
I just had a quick question. I think you mentioned, and I want to clarify that you said CEQA is no longer applicable for housing projects now, or just certain types of
certain types of projects. So there's a lot of allowances in state law, whether it's SB 35, which is a streamlining provision for the development of affordable housing, or SB 4, which provides allowances for the development of affordable housing on faith-based properties in the college proper or the higher education facilities. But in those instances, what was built into that legislation was that, you know, you're meeting a need with that type of a project, and so they've streamlined basically granting exemptions under environmental law, so that there's not a lengthy environmental process that would be required, where you'd be developing like an environmental impact report or doing a mitigated negative declaration. They meet requirements for exemptions, which is fast.
any other provisions for any other type of housing on the books or in the works now?
Not
infill exemption.
Yeah, there's an infill exemption, but there is other criteria associated with infill exemptions under CEQA for the development of housing. There's some other criteria about services and other things that have to be considered, and criteria that has to be met. And if you meet that criteria, that development may also qualify for exemptions. I just think that there's been a lot of work done in the affordable housing arena to sort of streamline the environmental process, which is great, because what we often see is CEQA being used as a reason to hold up the development of projects, which can be really frustrating and time-consuming and costly. So I think that one thing to our legislators' credit is making sure that they also put in those provisions that sort of streamline and allow for exemptions for those developments from CEQA.
There's a long list of these exemptions, like, and every year they come up with a new one, and it's additive. So you look at the exemptions, and then you figure out which one is the best match for the project and has the least strings attached, and will the city, also agree with.
Your development team would help, because an architect would be familiar with the requirements, and so they should be able to provide you options to take advantage of as Lou said, there are new laws every year, but your architect generally is on top of what the things are.
Hi, so question about sort of eligibility of SB4 with regard to affordability. Under the tax credit program, the higher the affordability or, lower the affordability, the more likely you are to get the tax credit award. Is there a threshold for affordability? 50%, 80%, 100%? AMI?
In SB4, I believe it's 80% is low, and then I think as much as 20% can meet the moderate level, if I recall correctly, in having reviewed that legislation. But yeah, I mean, the threshold is that 80% of the units need to meet low income thresholds.
Meaning 50% AMI by low income. How are they defining low income, if you remember?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's 80, right?
In my experience, what I found is that the different land use laws, such as density bonus, exemption, streamlining, they tend to have higher levels of, they tend to allow higher rents than a 100% affordable developer is going to rent at in order to get financing through competitive programs. So usually we look at these laws and they'll say you have to have this many affordable units, and for like an Eden project, we're like, yeah, done, of course, we need to do that anyways. But if you're looking at something that's mixed income, that's when you would have to go and look and take a very hard look. Those projects can be a lot harder to finance as well.
Okay, And specifically,
Example of where you have two basically sets of law. Tax credits are dealing with financing.
right,
SB4 is dealing with entitlements.
right.
So they, you know.
There's a little bit of a difference.
Right,
Yeah. which
so
is
those,
reasonable.
those two processes happen concurrently. And so you just have to be aware, you know, which side is it on, but you need both of them. Yeah.
Okay. And then I know you're representing the city of Hayward, but just, you mentioned the RENA, the Regional Housing. Is there any kind of now within cities an understanding of the need for essential worker housing, which is, generally speaking, they're well above affordable guidelines, but still a priority in this process or under SB4 or any other housing legislation? Thank you.
Not that I'm actually familiar with, but what I would say is that, cities are well aware of where our unmet needs are, and certainly share where we're seeing the needs within our communities when we're having those early conversations with developers coming in to develop projects, especially those for affordable. If they're not sure what they want to meet, some developers might come and say, hey, what's your unmet need in your community? We might say, hey, we really need workforce housing, or we're really in need of senior housing, or we're in need of housing for, whatever that vulnerable population might be in our city. And perhaps there's an alignment there with what is being proposed, and maybe there's not. But we certainly are aware of it and can communicate where our needs are. But as far as process or streamlining necessarily for that, I'm not familiar enough, and I don't know.
I don't think there's anything, I know that workforce housing is something that is needed in a lot of communities, and it really does help. And I don't know, I'm not familiar with the city of Hayward's housing element, but it does help if a city has identified a particular need, like workforce housing or teacher housing or something to that effect. That really helps in determining that it's not a fair housing issue. And so we actually use those policies to justify giving preference to a particular group, because otherwise you may have a fair housing issue in terms of providing preference.
So we're going to wrap up our panel, and if we can give them all a round of applause. They did a fantastic job. I don't have anything to say other than I'm just grateful that you all came. Please get folks' contact information, reach out to them. And I'm going to have Bishop Macklin close us. He's hosted us here today. Feel free to look around the campus. And we just are grateful for your time. And I just encourage you to continue to educate yourself on this journey. Measure twice and cut once, right? And build a team that shares your values and that makes sure people understand who you are and what you're doing. And don't be apologetic to anyone. This is your property. This is your process. You should be driving it. I don't care who the partners are. You're in control. So never let anyone convince you otherwise. But thank you very much. Bishop Macklin, you want to close us?
What a great servant of the Lord, and hopefully has he been helpful today? All of those who presented were helpful. Thank you very much, and for his firm that came, thank you all so very, very much. Why don't we all stand?
Can you tell us what's happening next door real quick?
Oh, yes, I can. Everybody, let's stand. This is church. We stand when we go home. All right. Yes, next door is our Family Life, Glad Tidings Family Life Complex, the Chester McLaughlin Wellness Center. And it's about, 14,000 square feet, something like that. But that is part of the campus. And you're welcome, of course, to look over that way. It's not finished, and they're working inside. But that's our next contribution to this neighborhood, so that all of the kids in this neighborhood, it has a STEM center. And so the next time you come, there should be little robots running all around welcoming you. And it has a teen center on one arm of it there. They're getting ready to put in all of the, talking about what games go in there for all the teenagers and all. I made a suggestion. I was overruled. My feelings are still hurt, but they were trying to figure out what kind of games, because I said, I'm telling you, you need pinball machines. But most of the kids didn't know what a pinball machine was anyway. But those were fun days. And it has a workout room that's in the back of it there, where the wall lets up and you can work out like you're outside almost. And Then it has a large gymnasium area, multi-use area that we'll use for conferences and for families and, of course, for kids' activities and adults. And so there'll be a walking track around the outside of it, but hopefully a place where this neighborhood that has no really other resources here, where kids and families can come here and do that. And it'll tie into the rest of the campus that we have here. So feel free to look around. If you need a wider tour, there's a golf court out there. I'm sure somebody can drive you around if you need to see it. And the sanctuary is open as well. But thank you for coming. Come back and see us again. We'll be delighted to have you at any time. Is that all right? All right. Keep painting on your canvas. Keep doing that. Dear God, we're grateful and thankful this morning for this time that we've had to share together with the faith community. People have come knowing that there's still more to be done. Would you empower them to do that? Allow them to see it. Because if they can see it, God, you can empower it to come to pass. And I pray that you'll be with them in all of that they do. And it doesn't make any difference who gets the credit as long as you get the glory. In your name we pray. Thank God and amen. Safe travel, everybody.